City Clerk. Item D.
Item 6D, deliberate and decide an appeal of the Planning Commission's decision to approve a conditional use permit, IP 17-025, for installation of a new wireless antenna on an existing utility pole located at 123 Elm Avenue.
Thank you. Before we begin, first and foremost, I know it's important, so if those in the back, I'll see you if you just raise your hand to say, I'm having a hard time hearing, and we'll ask maybe somebody's not speaking into the mic. So if you just kind of wave at me, I'll understand, and we'll make that better to the best of our ability. But I also, for the council and for myself, we know this is an important issue. We have received some of his phone calls, emails, of course, which have been seen by us, viewed, and in the record. It is important for us here to hear from everyone, from the appellant to the applicant, and of course, you, the public. The council did, at the July 24th meeting, close the public hearing, which were to continue to tonight. But we understand it's an important issue. You're here to speak to us, and we want to hear from you. So we're going to have public comment on this item again, as well as we're going to have the appellant and the applicant each receive the 10 minutes, which they'll go in the process, which have already received that. So we're trying to be extra understanding and to be appreciative of what everyone's feeling or wanting to express. As you know, on July 24th, we had about 10 speakers. We did 2 minutes each, so we will determine how many speakers we have and how much time will be allocated, but you will have an opportunity to speak. I also know that from some things that I have heard too is that this vote tonight is for the whole city of San Bruno. This appeal is specifically to 123 Elm. So I want to make that clear because some calls did come into the clerk's office with being told that this now one vote tonight, whether however the council's action is, was for a city-wide. That is not correct. So I just wanted to bring us up to speed. And of course, we're going to turn it over to staff and the presentation. So I'll ask the city manager to begin.
Sure.
Please.
So to the council and the public, I'll do a quick introduction of our process tonight for this item. And so we'll begin with the staff presentation that will begin. We'll have Michael Smith, our senior planner in our community development department, give the bulk of the presentation to bring us up to speed with the issues with this application. And then we'll turn it over to Gil Kimmish from Best & Krieger, who's a telecommunications attorney. She works with the city on our cable franchises, and she's also been special counsel to the city on this matter. Next, we will have the appellant give a presentation for 10 minutes. The applicant will then give a presentation for 10 minutes. We'll pause and have questions from council. Those questions can be directed to staff, the appellant, or the applicant. Next, we will have public comment, as the mayor just described. And then if there's a necessity for staff to respond to anything in the appellant's presentation, we'll do that. And then we will have council deliberation and action. And so now I'll turn it over to Michael.
And Mr. Smith, before you begin, I very much appreciate the last time we gathered on the 24th. I had asked for everyone to be respectful and mindful, allowing the speakers to speak, those under public comment, that opportunity to feel comfortable and confident at the podium. So no clapping at the end, please. Even if you disagree with something that's been stated, let's give that courtesy and respect to that speaker. It's not easy to get up at times to speak. So if we would just be mindful of that, I would very much appreciate that. And it was great the last time, and yes, we'll all applaud at the end. And I want to appreciate your attendance here this evening. Mr. Smith.
Thank you. Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council, Michael Smith, the Planning Department staff. This item is a conduct of business item from the carryover from July 24th City Council meeting for an appeal of the Planning Commission's approval of a project proposing to install a small cell wireless antenna on an existing utility pole near 123 Elm Avenue. The subject location is located within the right-of-way on Elm Avenue, between San Felipe Avenue and Santa Lucia Avenue. The proposal is to mount an antenna on top of an existing 38-foot, 6-inch wood utility pole, which would be screened within a cylinder that resembles a pole-mounted electrical transformer. The proposed antenna would measure approximately 4 feet tall and 14.5 inches in width, and would be installed on a 7-foot pole top extension at the top of the pole, rising to a total height of 49 feet 10 inches. 2 equipment boxes and a meter, each measuring approximately 2 feet long and 1 foot wide, would be attached to the bottom, near the bottom of the pole, approximately 7 feet above grade. And all equipment would be painted to match the existing pole. Now, just to discuss a little bit of the chronology behind the application. The applicant submitted this application on November 3rd, 2017. And then on June 19th, 2018, the Planning Commission held a duly noticed public hearing on the proposed use permit and approved it at that time by a vote of 3-1. On June 28th, 2018, the appellant appealed the Planning Commission's approval. On July 17th, 2018, Verizon submitted a response to the appeal, the applicant, excuse me. And on July 19th, 2018, the appellant submitted additional information in support of their appeal. On July 24th, 2018, the City Council held a duly noticed public hearing on the proposed appeal and received oral presentations from the appellant and the applicant, took public comment, asked questions of staff and the participants as appropriate, and closed the public hearing at that time. At the conclusion of the testimony, the council decided to continue this item at the suggestion of staff so that staff could come back to this meeting that we're having here today to provide more detailed analysis of the information that was provided. And we gave both the appellant and the applicant at that time until August 7th, 2018 to provide that information. So the next part of this is going to talk a little bit about the evaluation criteria. As I said before, this is a use permit, and so our code has some evaluation criteria for staff to abide by. The first one is aesthetics. The code requires that, where possible, that these facilities be stealth designed, and that is described as reducing the scale where possible, architectural integration where possible, colors, finish, and even using existing or proposed landscaping to blend the facility into the existing structural or visual backdrop of a neighborhood. Now here, where the project was submitted for review by staff, and in response to staff's initial review, the applicant revised the design of the facility to remove the proposed backup power cabinet at the ground level, which was placed in the parkway strip in front of the property, which eliminated any obstruction at ground level for pedestrians or parked cars with their doors open. The applicant also streamlined the design of the installation to be less obtrusive as possible, using the smallest equipment that could be used for the accessory equipment, which is lower down on the pole. And for these reasons, we feel that it has met the aesthetics requirement. The next requirement is structural capability. The applicant performed an initial structural capability to make sure that this pole could handle what is being proposed. Staff will do a more formal analysis of the structural capability once it is submitted for building permit. And then the third check is that PG&E, who's the owner of the pole, will also do a structural evaluation. So there are 3 structural evaluations to make sure that this will not fall over. The third one is height. The property is located in a residential zone, and in residential zones, the height limit for buildings is 28 feet. However, the height limit for a facility such as this is 50 feet. And as I said earlier, this structure with the pole top extension would be 49 feet 10 inches, thereby being below the required height limit, so it does comply with that requirement. The next criteria is maintenance. The project's applicant has said that this would be maintained during the hours of 8 to 5 and only periodically. It would be primarily maintained from off-site by the carrier themselves. So we feel that the maintenance criteria has also been met. The next criteria is a public notice is required for this. For the earlier meeting on July 24th, we did a 300-foot notice for that meeting. And at the last meeting, we agreed to do a 600-foot notice for the meeting we're at here today. So we did do a notice to 600 foot. So we are more than meeting and exceeding the noticing requirement. The next criteria is that when a facility is going to be placed within a residential zone, the carrier must prove that they must demonstrate that there was no other non-residential district or location for this facility. And in response to that, the applicant has provided coverage maps. They're finding that most of their current users are now in homes which are located in neighborhoods. And to meet that need, and they cannot place the antenna as far away as El Camino Real, which would be the closest commercial or industrial zone for this. And so, therefore, in our minds, they have proven to us that they need to put it at this particular location. And if you have further questions about that, I think that the applicant may be able to further explain that. And then lastly, the criteria requires that there be an RF study that is submitted for this proposal. And the applicant did submit an RF report in compliance with federal requirements. The staff has a RF consultant, and we use them to peer review the report to ensure that the report is in compliance. That was done, and it has been confirmed that whatever radio frequencies that are released are in compliance with federal requirements for this. So I'm going to move on to the applicant's concerns that were raised in the materials that were submitted by the August 7th, as I spoke of earlier. So their first concern is the radiation, that the radio frequency radiation that would be released by this facility in a residential neighborhood. And as I said before, the applicant has provided an RF report. That RF report has been peer reviewed, and it is found to comply with all federal requirements. One of the comments that was also raised was that the compliance with the federal requirements did not take into consideration prolonged exposure. Staff reached out again to our peer review consultant and verified that compliance with federal requirements includes prolonged exposure for an indefinite time period. The next concern raised was concerns about safety. The appellant has suggested that the proposed facility would be unsafe because of the risk of earthquake, fire, or high winds, but has not provided any particular evidence that installing this facility on this pole will increase the risk that the pole will fail if these calamities occur. As noted earlier, as part of the building permit approval process, staff will review structural information about the pole submitted by the applicant, and PG&E will do the same, and will make an independent determination whether the pole meets all applicable safety regulations. The appellant raised a concern about property values. and has suggested that the proposed facility would decrease property values within this neighborhood. Staff has reviewed that information that was provided and finds that it is not germane. None of the studies cited examined the type of facility being proposed right here. In addition, most of those studies were from over a decade old, the ones that were provided. And for that reason, we don't feel that it is applicable or germane to this particular facility. And then the other concern was raised about the neighborhood notification process. So again, the initial meeting was noticed to neighbors within a 300-foot radius, and then again for this meeting, we expanded that to a 600-foot radius. So we feel that we have more than met the notification requirement. There was concerns raised about noise. When the applicant removed the backup power cabinet from ground level, that would have required cooling fans. Those cooling fans turn on every so often to cool down the devices, but because those are gone, there are no longer any moving parts associated with this facility, so there would be absolutely no noise emitted from this facility. The appellant claims that there was no alternative site analysis done that proves that they need to put this facility in a residential zoning district. And the applicant, in response, did submit coverage maps that show existing and proposed signal strength near the site, evidencing that the proposed installation would provide additional data capacity within the proposed service area and provide better in-building coverage. The other concern raised by the appellant was that there are other sites that are being proposed by this applicant that are not before us, and that is true. The applicant has a number of sites, I believe up to 9 sites within the city of San Bruno for which applications have been submitted. But this is the only one that is before you today. Each site must be reviewed independently of another. The applicant has also confirmed that each site works independently of each other. So even if none of the other ones get approved, this one by itself will be meeting a need. And lastly, the normal review process is to review each site independently, not bring all 9 or 10 sites up for review at one time. So this is consistent with our practice. And then lastly, zoning code and general plan compliance. The appellant has stated that the application does not meet applicable zoning code and general plan policies regarding the zoning code, the appellant states that the facility would not meet applicable setbacks. The setback regulation is not applicable to this project because it is an existing structure and it is located within the right-of-way and not on private property. So therefore, it is not subject to the normal code's setback requirements. And regarding general plan compliance, the public facilities and services element of the general plan specifies, and I quote, "Work with telecommunication providers to ensure that telecommunication service is available for existing and future development." The code reinforces this objective by providing that utility distribution facilities, including but not limited to electric, communications, and cable television, shall be allowed in all districts. So I'm going to move forward to the findings that need to be made and that were made by the Planning Commission as the project was approved. The first finding says that the location, size, and intensity of the proposed operation will not create a hazardous or inconvenient vehicular or pedestrian traffic pattern taking into account the proposed use as compared with the general character and intensity of the neighborhood. We feel that is met, and we feel like that is met more when they remove the cabinet from the ground. The second finding, the proposed development as set forth on the plans will not unreasonably restrict or interfere with light and air on the property and on the other property in the neighborhood, and will not hinder or discourage the appropriate development and use of land and buildings in the neighborhood or impair the value thereof, and is consistent with the design and scale of the neighborhood. So again, they're using an existing pole that is already there. It's a minimal, somewhat minimal addition to that pole of about 11 feet. There are other poles in the neighborhood. We feel it is consistent with that neighborhood, as it is not a brand new tower. And as I stated before, there's no evidence to prove that it would affect the value of the neighborhood. The third finding, the improvement of the structure as shown on the elevations as submitted is not detrimental to the character or value of an adjacent residential district. No noise, minimal. So we find that it would comply with this and meet this finding because it does not emit any noise, which is consistent with the residential district. It is minimal aesthetically, as they have pared it down to the newest equipment to try to streamline this. It meets the RF compliance requirements, as I stated earlier as well. The fourth finding, the general appearance of the proposed building, structure, or grounds will be in keeping with the character of the neighborhood, will not be detrimental to the orderly and harmonious development of the city, and will not impair the desirability of investment or occupation in the neighborhood. And again, we find it is still consistent with the character of the neighborhood and would not affect property values. The fifth finding, and it's only one more after this, the proposed development is consistent with the general plan. And as I stated earlier, we have that requirement that we work with telecommunications providers to provide service to future development. And then the last finding is the proposal will not, under the circumstances of the particular case, be detrimental to the health, safety, morals, comfort, and general welfare of the persons residing or working in the neighborhood of such proposed use.
Please, I've asked for everyone to get the same respect. Please, no interruptions from the audience.
And we feel like this finding is met because the project's RF report complies with federal guidelines. So this concludes my portion of the presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to our outside counsel, Ms. Karrasch. Thank you.
Good evening. This on, right? Yeah, I just have to be really close to it. Okay, here we go. Good evening, Honorable Mayor and members of the City Council. I am pleased to be here this evening to help you go through this matter. My name is Gail Karrasch, and I am a telecommunications attorney and a partner at Best & Krieger. My office is based in Los Angeles. I have been working in the telecommunications field for I think about 20 years now, and I've had the pleasure of advising the city on a wide range of cable and telecommunications matters, and more lately wireless matters, probably for nearly a decade. So I'm just going to speak very briefly on a couple of issues, and just one slide. This is a very complicated area of the law, and so I think that was the thinking behind having me here to answer some of the questions that might come up as you deliberate. The options for council are already set forth in the staff report. There were three laid out there. Grant the appeal, which would mean to deny the applications. deny the appeal, which would mean granting the application, and postponing the decision, for example, to take in additional information. There are, as I mentioned, a lot of both federal and state laws that have implications and impose some limitations on your authority to act in this area. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of them that I think might be pertinent to your consideration. One is that federal law prohibits cities from regulating any placement of wireless facilities based on a consideration of the health effects or environmental effects of RF radiation. And that is in the case where the applicant is able to demonstrate that what they are proposing to install complies with the standards that have been set by the Federal Communications Commission, who is the federal authority that is the only authority that has the ability to set what are safe standards in that area of RF emissions. The second is there have been a number of Federal Communications Commission orders and rulings and regulations over the years that have imposed some time limits for action by local governments and on wireless facilities applications. And in this case, the application that is before you on appeal was subject to and is subject to approximately 150-day presumptively reasonable period to act. And we have, in this instance, there are ways to stop the shot clock from going. They call that tolling. And in this case, our understanding is that there has been an agreement with the applicant to toll the time for action up until this meeting tonight. The last thing that I'll mention is just a brief explanation of the situation when a facility is being proposed in the public right-of-way. There is, under state law, a state grant of a franchise to telephone companies to use the public right-of-way for the installation of their facilities, and that is tempered by local authority to determine whether any installation would incommode the public. It's kind of arcane language that is in the statute in Public Utility Code 7901, and that has been interpreted in the courts to mean that you can look at certain types of safety elements that haven't been preempted by the California Public Utilities Commission, and also you can consider aesthetics. And your code expresses the aesthetic values of the community, and so that's where I think that you have the staff have done their evaluation based on what your standards are in the code in looking at this application. I'm here to answer any questions as the night goes on, and thank you for listening.
Okay, so that's it from staff at this time. All right, again, if you desire to speak, you need to fill out a speaker's card, which Vicki is in the back for convenience. There's the deputy city clerk, and the city clerk's up front. We're going to move on to the appellant's oral presentation, then followed by the applicant's oral presentation. Keep in mind that on both sides it is 10 minutes only, and the time will begin, which will be recorded by the city clerk once the speaker begins conversation at the podium. So right now, I'd like to ask the appellant for the presentation and may obviously articulate the evidence that they've submitted and provide other information for the City Council's review, or may ask also witnesses to provide oral testimony in their 10 minutes. So if we can have that, please.
Good evening, Mayor and City Council members. We've obtained and shared information so the San Bruno City Council can make an educated decision to overturn the Planning Commission's approval to place Verizon small cell RF towers in our neighborhoods. And it will be in our neighborhoods. We submitted this information to you between June 28th and August 7th. It included telecom experts, scientists, CPUC fire reports, environmental studies, exhibits, signature petitions, links to Planning Commission meetings, and a Verizon video alternative to micro RF towers. This video that we submitted shows the least intrusive tower solution, and they have one, and it could be set 1,500 to 3,000 feet away from our homes. The city must retain control on its property and retain control over these telecoms. The full extent of the tower rollout plan has not been communicated to the public, nor any independent gap coverage studies. We oppose 49-foot, 10-inch tall towers outside our homes. They are overscaled towers that dwarf our single and two-story homes. They are overscaled for congested, narrow streets and sidewalks. The electrical equipment intrudes on narrow sidewalks at 7 feet above ground level. The sky above our legacy trees will be peppered by a forest of antenna towers. We oppose added electromagnetic fog in our environment. We oppose the permanent scarring of our neighborhoods. The towers seen from our living rooms, family rooms, bedrooms, views of sunrise, the bay, and mountains are spoiled. Trees, landscaping, and backyards are subject to damage during installations, maintenance, and by equipment. Legacy trees once damaged are irreplaceable in our lifetime. Who will carry the liability for damage of our trees and our property? These towers are the tallest objects on the block and a safety hazard. San Bruno experiences dry lightning in summer, severe thunder and lightning storms in winter. These antennas can be instruments in drawing lightning strikes near our homes. The San Bruno Gap winds average 35 to 52 miles an hour, playing roles in fire damage and danger. CPCU found telecom equipment on overloaded PG&E poles were snapped by Santa Ana winds, causing the Malibu Canyon fire. We do not need another Sonoma, a Sulphur fire, or a Crestmore. We stand with those city councils and commissions who unanimously voted to stop the installations of close proximity microwave radiation antennas in residential zones. They were Monterey, Hillsborough, Burlingame, Petaluma, recently Mill Valley, Ross, San Anselmo, Burbank. Monterey's independent rollout study plan for 8 square miles was submitted to you. This is not just one tower, these are hundreds of towers. Our 4-block study, based on what Verizon specs were put out, estimated 9 to 10 towers in our neighborhood, and this was spoken about at the first planning meeting that we went to. We have provided you with independent experts assisting other cities. We recommend the City Council work with them before any further approvals, and we would like you to overturn the Verizon application. Thank you.
Please refrain. You're taking their time, please.
Thank you, Honorable Mayor and City Council, for the opportunity to express our opinions on this matter. I would hope and expect that the City Council has read my 21-page brief and the 3 cases that I cited and provided that demonstrate you absolutely have authority to regulate this matter over aesthetics. I will not repeat those arguments. I will focus instead on the staff report, which I think could not have been written any better than if Verizon had written it themselves. I am extremely disappointed in...
Hold on, please. Please, stop the clock. Folks, I've asked us to please give each speaker the respect. Once you do that, you're interrupting them, their flow of communication, as well as their time. So this is the second time I've asked. Please allow everyone to be heard equally. Begin the clock, please. Sorry for the interruption.
The staff report basically recommends that everything Verizon submitted is fine and nothing the appellant submitted is correct. I submit that that's absolutely backwards. The staff report doesn't even mention the fact and gets wrong that this appeal is brought by Ms. Emley. It's brought by her and me, something that's pointed out on page 1 of my brief and has been pointed out to staff before. It gives Verizon's opinions weight that it's not due. There is no significant gap in coverage anywhere. Verizon could locate this cell site in a non-residential area. There is no alternative analysis. Looking in the same 500-foot radius is not an alternative analysis. An alternative analysis is looking somewhere other than residential neighborhoods. The staff report faults the application for not providing substantial evidence. That's absolutely incorrect. We've provided plenty of substantial evidence. The fact that we're not a billion-dollar corporation that does this day in, day out doesn't mean that our opinions and the evidence that we offer is not substantial. It is. We presented substantial evidence that the City Council may grant the appeal based on aesthetics. See pages 17 through 20 of my letter of August 7, 2018. That includes that this is a commercial apparatus that detracts from the residential character of the neighborhood. A tower 50 foot high negatively impacts the views. A 50-foot pogo stick relative to houses that are 15 to 25 feet is an aesthetic problem. Mock-ups of these cell towers are out of proportion to the surroundings, and public comments are also to be taken into account as aesthetics. The City Council has plenty of information in front of it to reject the application submitted by Verizon. It is not limited to a single statute that talks about stealthing. To consider that stealthing is the City Council's only grounds for rejecting this permit is incorrect. The staff seems to steer the City Council in favor of big business over the constituents of this city, and one has to ask why. The Telecommunications Act cited in my brief says, the upshot is simple. This court may not overturn a city's decision based on substantial evidence grounds if that decision is authorized by the applicable local regulations and supported by reasonable amount of evidence, Metro PCS versus City of San Francisco. Remember, this is the same staff that recommended granting the appeal in the first place. This is the same staff that recommended that you do not have authority to deny it. I don't think that you should be listening to those types of opinions because they're absolutely and categorically wrong. We have provided the City Council with Sprint PCS versus City of Palo Verde, T-Mobile versus City of San Francisco, Extenet versus City of Burlingame. In all three of these cases, the City Council denied a permit such as this on aesthetic grounds and won. I think that the report given by the staff is, in my opinion, cowardly because it takes the position that this cannot be resisted and the city has to roll over. And I have to wonder, what kind of city do we live in when our staff recommends that big business can come into our town, get a cell tower that nobody but it wants, and we simply have to take it? The City Council has plenty of authority to reject this appeal, and it can and must do so. The City Council is here for San Bruno's citizens. I can't imagine how City Council members could vote to deny the appeal and live with themselves when it becomes clear in the future that cell sites do in fact cause cancer. Remember, not too long ago, Big Tobacco was selling us on smoking doesn't cause cancer. They're not saying that now, but it took a long time to get there. Let's not take that amount of time over cell towers. We've submitted plenty of evidence of people far smarter than me who are scientists who say that these cell towers are dangerous and should not be above our homes. There is a reasonable place to put these. It's not above our homes. It's in a commercial or industrial district. This cell tower is not needed, it's not wanted, it does not fix a coverage gap, and it can be located elsewhere. How would this City Council grant the permit when it has the authority to deny it? And clearly, from my perspective, the will of the San Bruno residents is to deny the permit and grant the appeal that rejects it. The city staff report creates a false sense of obligation to grant the permit. The City Council should not follow such erroneous and cowardly advice. If San Bruno will not stand up for citizens who do not want this, who is the City Council representing? If you allow San Bruno to be a doormat, you can expect a pylon of corporate telecoms and others to bombard San Bruno with their schemes to make money at our expense. In my book, San Bruno is not without a backbone, and it's not for sale to corporate interests. I urge the City Council to stand up for San Bruno, to join with Burlingame, Hillsborough, Monterey, San Francisco, Palo Verdes, and many other municipalities who rejected this, and stand for its citizens. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments to both. Thank you very much. Please, folks, we're going to have our time to applaud. We'll all do it together, including the council. At this time now, the applicant oral presentation. Again, 10 minutes. We'll begin once you start. And as well, you can articulate the evidence that may have been submitted and provided to the council for review or other witnesses that you wish. But it will begin 10 minutes, and the clerk will keep time once you begin.
Good evening, Mayor Medina, members of the council. My name is Paul Albritton. I'm outside counsel for Verizon Wireless. Thank you so much for your time this evening reviewing our application. I have with me Gerald Bushberg. He's a medical physicist from Davis. Mark Peters, who is the consultant who spoke at our last meeting. Dwayne Bonham, who's an RF engineer, and I'm going to turn the mic over to Dwayne pretty shortly to explain to you why this cell site is located, where it's located. Carmina de Guzman is the RF engineer that developed this design. I begin, as I did last time, by telling you that Verizon Wireless, is, like all other wireless carriers, is experiencing this expansive growth in demand for its services, doubling almost every year. 52% of households don't have a wireline phone anymore. The average household has 13 connected devices. Our demand is residential. People are using phones in their homes. They expect them to work in their homes, and they're demanding more and more data, and Verizon is doing everything it can to provide that service in the most aesthetically pleasing manner possible. And in my 30 years of working in this, we've moved from mountaintop cell towers to fake trees to building-mounted facilities to now what is the most elegant form of providing these services, and that is using our public right-of-way, using our telephone poles and putting telephone equipment on telephone poles with extremely small equipment. The appellant spends 24 pages of his report explaining to you how you can deny a facility based on aesthetics, and we absolutely agree that you have the right to regulate aesthetics in your right-of-way, and that's why this site is designed not like in Palos Verdes Estates that he cites, where actually in Palos Verdes Estates 9 years ago they approved 8 sites and denied 2 sites based on aesthetics because those were towers with panel antennas, ground-mounted equipment, several boxes of ground-mounted equipment, as well as a new pole that was being proposed, a 45-foot pole. So we have come a long way in our aesthetic design. We have an antenna that is designed to mimic the shape of the utility pole. We have radios that have been redesigned to be narrow and fit the shape of the utility pole. They're self-cooled so that they're passively cooled, they have no fans, they're absolutely silent, and they're made to disappear on the utility pole using existing infrastructure rather than putting in new monopoles or new trees. So while we agree you can regulate on aesthetics, we don't disagree with the appellant on that point. Where we disagree is that we believe that there's no evidence that this creates any significant aesthetic impact. It raises the existing pole by 11 feet, and we believe that in that the appellant errs. The other issue that the appellant is focused on is, of course, RF emissions. We had a report prepared. You had an independent expert review that report who confirmed that the emissions at the nearest home was 1.3% of the federal standard. Mr. Bushberg came and spoke to you about that and how the energy from a cell phone is 1,000 times higher than the energy from the antenna on the pole, and that the low energy from the pole actually reduces the amount of energy that the phone needs to talk to, because the phone has to talk to that antenna. And if it's talking to El Camino Real, it's using a lot more energy. He relates property values to this, and this under federal case law and is common sense that the depreciation of property values based on a fear of RF emissions is the same thing as a denial based on property values. So it's a red herring of an issue, and there are many studies that show, in fact, that people prefer a home that has wireless services. I'm going to skip the next issue and just move on to the last one, which is that The issue is, why are we in a residential zone? And it goes way beyond coverage maps. It goes to capacity, local facilities, how our network is put together. I'm going to turn this over to Dwayne Bonham, who's got a short presentation for you. The information is not evidence that's necessary for your decision, but we felt it was important for you to understand how carefully Verizon Wireless designs its networks and why this facility is being proposed where it is. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Dwayne. And now we'll need the president.
Thank you, Mayor and council members. Just a little bit of information on some of the specifics here. This is a coverage map of the existing coverage within the area. Now this is at the higher frequencies, which is where our capacity comes from. We have lower frequencies that are used for coverage. They cover a much wider area. They're much more effective. However, think of it as a very small pipe or a very small hose. It provides a little bit of capacity to a lot of area. In order to provide higher capacity that's needed, especially in some of these dense residential areas, we need the bigger pipes that the higher frequency, what's called PCS and AWS, provides. However, those higher frequencies don't propagate or travel as far. So what you see here is the small green areas around the existing cell sites. That is where the higher frequencies are effective. The red areas are areas where those higher frequencies are not effective at providing higher capacity. The pink area is where the proposed cell site is. You can see that's surrounded by red. This shows the sectors that are exhausted. You can see the red pie-shaped pieces pointing all towards this are sectors that are overloaded. They are currently over capacity. This is a capacity map that we use for engineering, or a capacity chart that shows the usage on a particular sector. The red lines is where we start seeing service degradation. The main server for this area is what we call SFO West. And as you can see, the red line is far below. The green line is the current usage, or the historical usage, up to current. And as you can see, that is well above the red line. That site there is completely exhausted, and we are seeing substandard service. Secondary sector that is covering there, you can see the very high growth on it because of the fact that SFO West cannot handle the traffic there. You see the very high growth rate in that data, and it is starting to exceed capacity and is trending to be in bad shape by the end of the year. This is a before coverage map. The area in green, this is a best server map. The area in green that surrounds the pink is what SFO West currently covers. As you can see, it does cover some of El Camino Real, and it covers quite a bit of residential area to the west. This is adding the proposed site, which is shown at the location in pink, and the blue area is the area that this proposed site would cover. You can see it does a very effective job of covering a wide area of the residential traffic. This is the a terrain map showing the terrain. One other study we did just as an internal check to make sure that we're providing the right solution. If we build incorrect solutions to problems, it costs us money. As a corporation, we're not big on wasting money. So we double check these things to make sure that when we're building a project, that project is going to have the desired result. We looked at the time of day usage for this area and found that the busy hours for the use are 9 to 10 p.m. The traffic at 9 to 10 p.m. is about double what we see in the 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., which is their normal business model period. That told us that, yes, we do need to be building something to take some of the residential usage off of that overloaded site in order to solve the problem. Map of the location. This shows that the area that we need to serve is all primarily residential. We already have cells down in the commercial district. that is east of El Camino Real. This is a high-frequency zoomed-in before coverage map showing that in the high-frequency band, which is what provides the capacity, we're very weak. This is the high-frequency coverage map with the proposed site. So, I'm going to go ahead and save a few minutes for any questions that you guys may have, and go ahead and curtail the presentation there.
You can continue because we'll be asking questions
Okay.
in a little bit. Are you concluded, or do you have anything else? You have about a minute.
Just an overview. There's three things there. One, we hope this concludes it or shows that we do actually need the residential coverage and in-building coverage in order to solve the issue that we have. This is strategic capacity relief.
Excuse me. I'm sorry, sir. Time.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you to the applicant and to the appellant again. At this time, we're going to move into questions from council members to whether it be staff, legal counsel, appellant, or applicant. Do you have anything? No? Okay. Anything? Okay. Council members. It's your opportunity. Our opportunity.
Can I go back to the last, can I go first? Just one question.
I think you're on a roll. Yes, you can.
Um,
Please.
The map, can we bring this back up? The coverage area? Please?
Page number?
Page
Vice
6.
Mayor.
So
There you go.
can you repeat the comment that you mentioned? So this is an image with the new cell tower added and the new coverage that it's showing? And
Yes.
is that the area in purple?
This is what we call a best server plot, okay? So this is the area that would be, where service would be improved by this particular project. So the area in blue is the area which this project would improve the service to.
And is there any way to get street names or how far? I mean, this image doesn't really help me much in terms of the distance.
I don't have that information with me. If I remember right, it's about a half mile to the south and about a quarter mile to the north, and a quarter mile to the east and a quarter mile to the west.
Can you repeat that one more time?
About a quarter mile to the north, east, and west, and a little over a half mile to the south.
And
If I could play, hello? If I could play RF engineer just for a moment. If you back up one slide, you'll see in the, can you back up slide? That this is a best server plot, and you're looking at the sectors that are serving the area near the Elm Street facility. And you'll see that there are a confluence of different colors coming into that area, which shows that that area is being served by several different sites, which means there's no dominant signal in that area, which means that the system is having a hard time connecting to and keeping calls going in that area. And so what this site does in its current location, if you go to the next slide, is it fills in for each, it provides a dominant signal for each of those sectors that are coming from San Francisco Airport, coming from the west, coming from the north, and from the south. And by doing that, by offloading those, because the site has a harder time talking to a phone at a distance than it does closer, you're actually improving the capacity of all the sites around it by filling in this capacity gap where it is and offloading those antennas that are trying so hard to get into that particular residential area. And so it's not just the area that's covered, but it's the location and the capacity that it will offload. And Dwayne was showing you that slide where San Francisco Airport is tremendously offloaded, and we use a scale, something called ASEU, and Dwayne can explain that relates to the distance and number of phones that are being used at a simultaneous time. So it's with small cell technology We have a macro network that provides coverage, so you get bars of signal on your phone, but you don't have the capacity for that phone to then either connect, maintain a call, download information. So this is, the small cell is a way of taking that overlayment of coverage, like sprinklers on a lawn that provide coverage, and then providing a spot location where you've got additional capacity, like watering your lemon tree, to provide capacity, and in this case, offload those sectors, distant sectors that are having a non-dominant signal right at that location. I hope I explained that properly.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of how far we're talking. If we're carrying on a conversation across this complete room, I'm going to have to speak more slowly and much louder than if I'm standing a foot from you. If I'm standing a foot from you, I can speak more quickly and in a softer voice. Radio communications works a lot like that. As the user gets farther away from the cell site has to use more power, and it has to shape the communication in a way that it knows it's going to see lots of errors, and therefore it has to slow down the amount of data it can send, and it takes up more time.
Okay.
So a closer site is much more efficient, and this site will not just actually improve that area, it will improve every one of those red sectors that we're pointing towards. There will also improve the service to those customers.
Thank you. I do have other questions, but I think...
Well, let's not go back and forth, so, I mean, you want to come back?
Well, okay, I'll go.
Okay.
So I guess the other question would be then, based on the first question I originally asked you, would the distance quarter mile, half a mile? I know that the distance between the site you're proposing, the cell tower, and El Camino is about 0.2 miles. So less than a quarter of a mile, less than a half a mile. So again, when we talk about best placement for a cell tower, is the residential neighborhood the best option if there is the option for something in a commercial neighborhood like in El Camino and other areas? So I guess the questions that I have really lean towards sort of the gap in coverage, and that is trying to find the best possible site. I know at the July meeting there were a number of sites that were proposed, that they were all in residential neighborhoods. So tell me why we can't put a cell tower in a commercial area which is just 0.2 miles away.
So I'm going to begin and let Dwayne answer, but we've pulled up the terrain profile. And this is a terrain profile that shows the terrain from El Camino up to our site, which is in the middle. It's the little dot near the top of the terrain, and then drops back down to Cavalry Road, I think it is. And what it shows is that if you wanted a site to provide the area in the residential neighborhood that we are proposing, and you wanted to put it on El Camino, it's about 40 feet below. So you would have to have a site, we're at 50 feet, you'd have to have a 90-foot tall tower in order to see the coverage area that we're trying to see with this small cell. So El Camino is too low. And then the second reason is we have, can you go back to the exhausted sector? We have cell sites, to the west, macro sites to the west, not far from El Camino. And they're projecting as hard as they can into this residential area. But it's a distant signal, and again, what we're trying to provide is that nearby dominant, albeit low power, signal in the residential area, so that the macro sites are not exhausted as they try to throw their signal into the residential area. So that particularly now with this AWS frequency, which doesn't travel as far, the phones need to be near the antennas, near the end user. So that's why our investigations were really within that residential area, and El Camino is too far away. You can go to there's a zoning map, and the zoning map, you can see you have mostly residential in the entire area, other than the commercial industrial area along El Camino. And we have, this microcell stands, or small cell stands by itself in providing the important capacity offload and coverage that the engineers want to provide. And then we have another 8 applications for similar nodes around San Bruno to provide this strategic capacity offload and coverage, and that's how this network has been designed. I'm sure you know that there have been major objections to large macro cells, particularly in residential areas, and Verizon has had difficulty putting macro cells even along El Camino. So this is, we believe, aesthetically preferred to putting a very tall tower along El Camino that wouldn't provide any enhanced service over what we're proposing with this small cell network. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. So I bought a home in San Bruno over 20 years ago, and when I bought it, I've got this beautiful view that looks out along the SFO and beautiful view of the Mills Park neighborhood. Yet I look out my family room windows, and I have a utility pole in my backyard, and I see all the wires, and over the years as a resident, I've also seen the beautification happen in our city, whereas utility poles that once stood no longer. They are now underground. So I asked myself, well, I mean, and I understand the safety issue that I'm sure that most of the residents in this room have, but from an aesthetic standpoint, why would we want to add more ugliness to a pole that already is so ugly?
Well, that's a great question.
I mean, all I see is wires. I've experienced in our neighborhood alone safety issues with poles going down due to a fire. We had a neighbor that also had an explosion in their home due to a tree falling down, that the pole down, and it just sent an explosion of all the utility lines. So I have huge safety concerns when you've got utility poles that are next to residents, whether it's in my backyard or in my front yard, and we're going to add more things to it, but really the ugliness to it. I'd prefer if they came in and said, hey, we've got a great project that we're going to put all these wires in the ground. So the question I have is a technology out there to actually place something underground instead of up above that stands above 50 feet in the air?
Well, let me try and answer your question. Utility poles, of course, are for utility, and we didn't place them there. And I'm sure that anybody, given the opportunity, would like to have the utility pole taken away from in front of their home. For us, using a utility pole is a way of not adding infrastructure or vertical infrastructure into the right-of-way, and a way of using that existing utility structure, just like Comcast, AT&T, PG&E, cable companies, whoever it is, and we have those rights, and I think we've discussed under the California Public Utility Code to put telephone equipment on telephone poles, and that's the way that utilities have been provided to communities like San Bruno. We are all in favor of undergrounding. Undergrounding is not a problem for Verizon Wireless. Now, antennas are line of sight. They need to be above ground. In San Francisco, we have approximately 90 utility pole installations that have been approved, and nearly 400 light standard facilities, which are a simple 2-foot antenna that's placed on top of a light standard. We need more of those because they're lower down, and there are other issues related to that, and people object to a 2-foot antenna going on the light standard in front of their home for the reasons that you heard tonight. But we are working with the infrastructure that is available to us in trying to minimize the provision of this intensely important service, which has become vital to people's lifestyles and lives these days, in a way that it uses the existing utility infrastructure and not creating new utility infrastructure. When we use a utility pole, as we are in this case, the pole itself actually goes through a more rigorous review than all the other poles on the block that may be standing with wires and cables and potentially leaning. There's a structural analysis that's done by the CBR group, there's a structural analysis that's done by PG&E, and then there's a subsequent review by the city, and the CPUC reviews the analyses that we do. So that pole, once we put our equipment on it, and mind you, we're talking about 2 radios and a 4-foot antenna. This is not a lot of equipment. By the time that equipment is loaded, is put on there, it's been thoroughly reviewed and analyzed with respect to structural strength, and is likely concluded to be safer than any other of the poles on the block. If the pole is old or leaning or decayed during that process, Verizon Wireless pays to replace that utility pole, and a new utility pole is placed that has adequate strength. There was reference to the Malibu fire. That was 11 years ago, and SCE had not paid attention through a company named NextG to what was being loaded on some poles. And since that time, the California Public Utility Commission imposed $75 million in fines. Mind you, Verizon only paid $4 million, which is 5% of that fine. And that was to participate in replacing the poles so that they could put their equipment back up. But the SCPUC has strengthened their regulations since then. There's a great deal of oversight regarding poles, and that doesn't mean that PG&E and SCE hasn't gone through and done everything they need to do. I was in Santa Rosa on October 9th, and power was out, and we know why we think fires started there, but the only thing working for me that night was my Verizon Wireless cell phone, and which allowed me to evacuate the situation. So our feeling is we're a responsible utility. We work with Public Utility Commission. The pole, if anything, will be stronger, that we're happy even to have a condition of approval that if the site is ever undergrounded, that we would relocate the facility, presumably onto streetlights, and we don't consider that to be an impediment to your approval. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. So another question I have is regarding gapping coverage, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, but I'm sure there are residents who live in the area who will tell you that I have great coverage. I've been by there several times to check out the coverage, right? Either in my car, outside my car, walking down the street. And there is good coverage. Actually, I have better coverage there than I do at my own home. So the gapping coverage is something that is hard to understand. There's a map, but I don't know that where's the proof behind that. So I think we just need to be honest. Is it about today's gapping coverage, or is it about what's projected in the future for gapping coverage? I know the first comment that you mentioned in your presentation was that there is a demand, and that we're moving toward the need for everything is internet. It's everything we do has some sort of internet connected to it, whether it's for gaming or et cetera. So the gapping coverage is still a frustrating thing, as well as the confirmation of the distance, because I'm hearing 2 to 3 miles in some reports. Tonight I heard a quarter of a mile, I heard a half a mile. So I don't want to take up everybody's time, but I still have those questions as well.
I think it's a very important question. I'm again going to let Dwayne add on to what I say. Again, a small cell like this, because it is extremely low wattage and 2 little radios, does not have a very large coverage footprint, maybe 1,500 feet radius, quarter mile coverage, and that all depends on how the antenna is set up and so forth. The demand is today, and we put up again, these are ASEU charts showing that San Francisco Airport site facing this area has already exceeded its capacity. That means that it cannot react, correct me if I'm wrong, to every phone that's trying to connect to it with reliable signal and reliable speeds and a reliable call. You will get, I showed you the topographic profile. Up on that, where the pole is actually going to go, there's likely better signal there than below it where we're trying to serve, and particularly on the back side of it. We don't put cell sites down low where there's bad service. We put them, up where they're able to provide service over a broader area. So the actual pinpoint location of the pole is not necessarily the exact place we're trying to serve. And as I'll reiterate again, we have a confluence of several sectors of antennas coming in from other directions that are competing in that area to provide service from a distance. And this offloads each of those sectors in a manner that improves the service in that quarter mile area, but also to all of those overloaded sectors. Can you go to the overloaded sector file? So if you look at this slide, you'll see the sectors that are facing the area that we're trying to serve. And the red triangles are the antenna directions that are currently overloaded. In other words, that ASEU is exceeded. And so we are trying to improve the capacity in San Bruno, and that's to serve during high capacity times. And Dwayne told you when our graphics show what those high capacity times are. They imply that they relate to residential use, evenings and mornings. And so we are addressing a capacity situation now through this proposed small cell network in strategic locations that offload capacity to particular sectors in particular strategic ways. And so it's not the broad coverage of that pole. It is a way of providing this water faucet of capacity in a designated area that helps the entire network. And that's why I'll apologize and segue to our last slide, which is that in California, because we have the right to use the right-of-way as a telephone corporation, we're not obligated to demonstrate that we need the site in the right-of-way. It's not, you don't require PG&E to show why they need to put a transformer on a pole. We have the right to use the right-of-way without demonstrating that each pole is required. And separately, I have to say that the FCC governs the antennas and the radios, and there's case law that a community can't say, we don't want small cells, we want macros, or we don't want macros, we want small cells. The case actually is the opposite. Clarkstown, New York, they wanted this kind of network instead of macro sites. But the case law says that you can't really tell us which way to go. All of that being said, we wanted to come to you and provide this information so that you understood the decision that you're making this evening, and we appreciate the questions. I'm going to let Dwayne add anything he wants to add.
Yeah, just a little bit about the gap in service. What you'll see as a sector starts to overload, your phone may still show 2-3 bars, whatever that is. Voice calls will probably be fine. What happens when the 4G data network overloads is you start seeing the throughputs on your device slow. We're at the point now on this one where you're going to see slower throughputs. If you run a speed test at 9 p.m., you're going to see what we would call a very low throughput number. You run that at 6 a.m., you're going to show a much higher throughput number, what would be closer to an unoverloaded sector. As that continues to progress and traffic grows, and you'll notice our usage grows at about 70% a year. If you look at the one on the right, you'll see that that's showing normal growth. That sector has not fully exhausted yet. It is continuing to show the growth in usage that we normally see on our network. The one on the left side has flatlined. It is no longer showing any growth. That is a sign that has reached its maximum capacity. Therefore, the throughput speeds are slowing down. And what will eventually happen is you'll try to launch an app on your phone, and it won't launch. It'll time out. I'm just going to use Facebook. You click on Facebook, and it's going to sit there, and it's going to sit there, and it's going to sit there, and it's going to show network unavailable, or it's just going to time out. And that's what we'll eventually be seeing throughout the sector. Facebook, not a big deal. When it's police or fire that are responding to a call, and yes, they do use our 4G networks for quite a bit of their communications. That becomes a problem and a health and safety concern.
Just to add that sector that is trending upward, it exhausts next month.
My last question is in regards to safety, and that is that how can we ensure that these sites are complying with federal law? So we install them today. I know there's a 24/7 monitoring, but it's done from a laptop or it's done from a distance. How do we ensure compliance? Well, we first, and I don't know if Gerald Bushberg wants to speak to this because you might be getting tired of me, but their FCC compliance requires that our expert, which was confirmed by your expert, conduct calculations that determine the radio, the wattage of the radio, the gain from the antenna, and how much energy comes from that antenna. And then they calculate the worst case scenario, could that facility ever exceed the FCC public exposure limits?
And that calculation is worst-case scenario, and it shows that this facility could never get to that point. In addition, we do post-installation testing. That means we're required by the conditions of approval to go out and actually measure and test the facilities. And I want Gerald to talk about what happens when you go out and measure. And then Verizon is now in a current process of testing their sites on an annual basis. But I will let Gerald speak to the difference between the calculations, the measurements, and the potential that this would exceed the FCC standard.
Yeah, hi, Gerald Bushford, Health and Medical Physics Consulting from Sacramento, California. Yeah, a couple reasons that would not be a concern. First of all, as has been stated, the analysis is done on a worst-case situation. So these are maximum power outputs from the radios, and a lot of assumptions are made in the analysis that these computer-based studies are done that are in fact not actually occurring in real space when measurements are followed up to find out what the actual excuse me, what the actual exposures are. In my experience, having done hundreds of these where calculations were done and then measurements were done to follow up, typically the measured values are typically between half or 1/10 of that maximum is calculated. And in no cases have I ever found where a report was done correctly that the measured values were the same or greater than that was provided by calculation.
And is the measured value done on site, or is that from a distance?
No, it's done on site. Usually done in areas where we would expect the highest exposures to occur, and then in addition, sometimes we make measurements where people might be, especially concerned, or a particular individual might want to have it in one particular area, so accommodations are made. And the other reason that you can be assured that someone wouldn't sneak in the middle of the night and turn up the power or something like that is because the very nature of the technology precludes the want or the need to increase the transmission power, because they are reusing these frequencies at distant sites. So they need the power to stay within a very small constrained area so that they can reuse this frequency at a distant cell. If they were to turn up the power of these individual cells, they would end up with a crosstalk like a party line of the old days, which would defeat the whole purpose of a cellular network. So the very nature of cellular technology limits the need for higher power, and actually requires multiple low power sites in order to enable the reuse of these frequencies at other locations.
Okay, thank you.
Other council members? Mr. Salazar.
Thank you.
Mike.
So if I understand this correctly, when we're looking at this best server plot, and you say that SFO West is overloaded, that's basically an antenna that's reached its maximum capacity to transfer data. And you told us that another macro site or a macro site at the location that you're proposing wouldn't work, or actually, I believe what you said was that a microsite placed anywhere in the commercial area would not accomplish what you would want, but wouldn't a macro site, a second macro site somewhere within the airport area accomplish the same thing that you're trying to do, basically adding capacity by adding an antenna?
It would add much less capacity. Once again, the reason we're exhausting is the distance from the users from the site. If we put in a site that's still distant from the users, its carrying capacity is going to be much lower than a site that is closer to where the actual users are. Does that make some sense? The high frequencies that carries the big portion of our capacity. I'm going to go back to the coverage plots for the macro sites in the area. As you can see, the macro sites that are at the lower left and the the lower right and the upper right, and then on the far left-hand side, those are macro cell sites. And you can see that the high frequency does not travel all that far, even from a macro site at the higher power levels. So placing one down there on El Camino Real still isn't going to take care of a lot of the residential area that's up there. It's just not going to transmit that far. It's going to overload probably as soon as we turn it up. It's going to be over capacity, and we're going to be right back where we are now, which is proposing something where the customers are using their phones, which is within the residential area.
Okay. So, going back to your proposed microcell solution, can you talk a little bit about the height of the mast? And so I know that you're staying under the 50-foot restriction, but ideally, is that really where this antenna would have its best utilization? Or I kind of got the gist that maybe you were forcing it to stay under the 50, but you would prefer it to be taller?
I'll briefly explain that we are on a PG&E pole. The PG&E pole is governed by the California Public Utility Commission, something called General Order 95. And General Order 95, Rule 94, regulates where antennas can be placed on a utility pole. General Order 95 is what requires that the meter be 7 feet above the ground. It requires that there is a quarter of the pole that's left open for a lineman to climb the pole. It requires that there's a 4-inch gap between the radios and the pole so the lineman can get his belt between the pole and the radio. And it also requires that our antenna be 6 feet, a minimum of 6 feet above the lines, the transmission lines. And that's to protect the lineman if he has to go and work on the antenna, that he's got enough distance that he's not crowded or stepping on the transmission lines. So the bayonet that we are using, the 7-foot bayonet that goes on top of the utility pole, is designed and approved by PG&E, and our antenna, it fits on top of that bayonet. If we had our way, we would put the antenna on top of the pole. But we have to maintain this distance between the transmission lines and the bottom of the mounting bracket on the antenna by the requirements of GO 95. And that's essentially why we're at the height that we are at.
So you're basically saying that you would prefer to be lower, not higher?
I'm saying that we could go lower, but we have only certain areas of the telephone pole that we can use.
Okay.
Yeah, for a typical small cell, from an RF design perspective, our preferred height is normally around 28 to 35 feet. Because of the fact that like I said, we're having to reuse these frequencies, we want these to cover a limited amount of space. How we limit the amount of space they cover is how large of antenna we use. The larger the antenna we use, the more we can control a site. So as we go lower down, we can get away with a smaller antenna, which is beneficial, and the easier it is for us to control a particular site. When we start getting up in the range of close to 50 foot or even sometimes over 50 foot, it becomes a little bit problematic for us. So yeah, we would rather be in the 35 foot range. If we were designing this and we could do whatever we like to do, we would be in that range.
Okay. And your report mentioned something about line of sight being important. So how does line of sight play into the placement and the height of the antenna?
Radio waves work a lot like light. If we were to take a street light and we were to put it down lower on this pole in the middle of this tree, it would not illuminate much. You wouldn't see it. It wouldn't be very valuable. Radio waves work pretty much the same. If you bury them within something, they don't work very well. So you do want to be above what we call ground clutter, which would be trees, above the roof lines, things that are gonna block the signal. So for that perspective, we do want to be above the trees in this particular location here.
And so that's giving you line of sight to what? To your macro towers or
No,
to the
users.
receivers?
Sorry, to the users. Yeah,
Okay.
This site from the antenna does not communicate with other sites. It communicates with the users, the user devices that are being used in the residences out
And how does it connect back to your system?
there, through fiber optics.
So you'll be running fiber optic cables to
Correct.
the pole. And so these microcells use a shorter wavelength. It doesn't penetrate obstructions as well, yet you're targeting this toward residential users that are going to be behind walls.
Correct.
How does that work?
That you have to have denser sites within any area where there's buildings as the higher frequencies go. The higher the frequency goes, the denser the sites need to be. Because these higher frequencies do not penetrate buildings well.
So
Lower
that
frequencies
seems
do.
contradictory to me. You don't want to put it behind a tree because it'll block the signal, yet you expect it to penetrate through walls, possibly. I mean, if you want to get a couple of blocks, you need to go through a few walls to get your signal to your end users.
And that's the reason we want them above the roof lines, is so we're not going through. The signal will shine over the rooftops, will reflect off an adjacent building, will come through windows. You will get it there. The further you get from the antenna, the less of the ability for it to penetrate buildings and get through buildings. The lower frequencies that we have do a much better job of penetrating buildings, much like sound. If your neighbor has his TV turned up too loud, you don't hear the higher frequencies through your walls. You're going to hear the lower frequencies come through your walls. Same thing works with radio signals. So that is true.
I think what he really means to say is that the RF energy, it will go through the leaves of the tree, okay, but that reduces the signal that's available to be used. So they attempt to avoid what they call clutter by placing it above those kinds of structures so that they have more of the signal available to be used by their customers. So it isn't that it can't penetrate through the branches of a tree, it's just that they try and avoid that so that the signal is available to be used by the customers.
Okay.
Got too many of us up here. Also, near-field clutter is going to be more of a problem than distant clutter. So a deciduous tree that's
Sir,
in front of the antenna will.
Okay, let the
We'll take
council
that.
member ask questions, and maybe a couple of you try to respond, because if there's so many, we want to make sure all council, and we want to hear from the public. Please.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
All right, thank you. I had a question about in the original proposal, there was a large box on the sidewalk that was eliminated. What was in that box, and where did that equipment go?
Hi, I'm Mark Peters with the CBR Group. What was in that box primarily was battery backup units that would power the facility during an event where the commercial power is lost and the PG&E power goes down. There is Verizon attempts to provide for emergency backup power as many of its sites as it can. And during an emergency like an earthquake or a power outage, people can still use their phones and the sites will operate. The ground cabinet can also house the electric meter, which we relocated the pole when we removed the ground cabinet for aesthetic and accessibility reasons.
Okay. Regarding the structural analysis that you said would be done on the pole, what exactly would that entail? Do you evaluate the age of the pole, the condition of the pole? I looked through that general order,
Yes.
and I didn't really see a whole lot of meat around what you look for, or what you have to build to.
So there's two parts that your question asks about two separate reports. One is intrusion testing, which tests the quality of the pole. In other words, has it been impacted by termites or dry rot, and the condition of the pole. And the owner of the pole, by order of the CPUC, has to do that on a regular basis to determine the condition of the pole. And we get a copy of that report. It's either called a test and treat or an intrusion report. And if the pole is either passed or failed, and we incorporate that into the software analysis that we perform for loading. And the software that we use is called OCalc Pro. It's the same software that PG&E uses. It's used across the country by most. It's really the industry standard for structural analysis on wood utility poles. And that takes into account all the forces on the pole. It takes into account wind, it takes into account seismic forces on the pole, It takes into account the guy wires and the tension that's placed on the pole. It also takes into account whether the pole is plumb or not plumb based on our visual inspection. And then the proposed equipment, the weight of that equipment is calculated as part of the analysis, and there's a determination made of the pole's structural capacity in relation to what is considered the acceptable level, which has a built-in safety factor on top of it. So that's the analysis that we perform and the same analysis that PG&E performs. And generally, as part of the building permit or encroachment permit process with jurisdictions, we submit that report. We have engineers that work, certified professional engineers of California, that review the report, certify the report, and then we submit it for peer review to various cities like your own.
Okay. And it looks to me like that pole might be leaning a little bit. So say the pole doesn't pass muster, then what? Do you have a plan B? What would you do in that case?
Yeah, plan B is to replace the pole. If during the course of construction or at some subsequent point something is determined to be deficient in the quality of the pole at that time, then PG&E as a pole owner generally has a responsibility to replace it. Verizon currently for these facilities pays for those replacements when they happen, and then the design change that you would see in this would be a pole for the same height, but a taller pole, because we wouldn't want to just put the same pole and then put a bracket extension on it. The pole would be taller that goes to the antenna so that the pole extends above the electric wires, and we don't have to use an extension to meet the safety requirement, but the overall height would be the same.
Okay. And that could potentially be a much more attractive solution than what we're being asked to approve today. I know that there are technologies out there that would allow for most of your infrastructure to be inside of a pole with nothing visible, and possibly even add capacity for other carriers.
No, the pole that would be replaced would be a wooden utility pole, not a hollow pole. PG&E currently does not place anything but wood poles with wood poles in residential areas to the greatest extent of my knowledge.
But don't you have an option to maybe not replace the wooden pole, but put up your own pole?
So the California Public Utilities Commission has very specific standards on poles for utility use, and in a lot of cities there are some older steel poles that have upside down trumpet looking transformers that were installed in the 60s and 70s, and they had problems, and they've discontinued the approval of those types of poles. So in my experience, no, there's been not any other pole that a wood pole would be replaced with other than a wood pole. And as a joint pole, it's not Verizon's sole discretion in what the pole was replaced with. PG&E has the majority opinion as a NCJPA owner member.
Well, suppose the city had an interest in having agreements with multiple carriers that when they come into a neighborhood that they share the cost of putting in an appropriate infrastructure and then sharing that. Is that something that Verizon or you as Verizon's representative would be open to?
Obviously, a theoretical question, and I can give you this answer, which isn't so theoretical. We have jurisdictions where they would prefer that we install a Verizon communications pole, and with a bare pole and an antenna on top and radios mounted on the side. It's pretty rare, and I can think of one in Southern California. I can also tell you that Laguna Beach, California, asked us to do exactly that. They said, can you design a separate pole? We did that. We spent an entire year, went through a process, came up with a very elegant pole, and then ultimately the community said they wanted us to go on the utility poles, not the standalone poles, because they didn't want the additional poles. Is it something Verizon will consider, on a long-term basis? Absolutely. Right now we're talking about 9 utility poles. If you were I'll have to speak to my client, but if you had a condition that said if San Bruno subsequently wants Verizon to install its own design poles and take this equipment down and put it on a city-approved design pole, I suspect that's something we'd be willing to do. But it's a broader community outreach process to come up with new infrastructure in the right-of-way. People don't like the utility pole in front of their house and somebody really doesn't want a new utility pole in front of their house where they've never had one. So that's been our experience, but I appreciate the thought.
One point with that, when we do, and I have done standalone poles in some other areas, they can't always be in the utility right away where there's above ground utilities. We cannot put a standalone pole under power lines. So it would most likely be across the street in a new area or in some area that currently doesn't have utility poles in it would be where we'd be directing those poles. Just so you understand that.
Okay. Okay, that's it for now.
Marty?
Thank you. So I've heard the increase in the data. It's not the increase in the phone calls, right? It's the data.
It is both. Voice phone calls now use data.
What-
It's transmitted to data. So your voice, your 4G, when you make a phone call on your 4G phone, there's a voice encoder inside the phone that takes your conversation, turns it into data, and it flows over the data network. Now, that uses a very low volume of data, and there's stuff that's done to prioritize voice phone calls over other types of general traffic. So the voice phone calls will be more reliable than Instagram or Facebook or uploading video.
Right. So, but the primary increase is due to the data. When people get home, they're getting on their phone to do stuff on the internet.
Correct.
Okay.
Data usage, and we'll generally see peaks of that at noon, 8 a.m., noon, 3 o'clock. The noon and the 3 o'clock and 8 a.m. are generally around schools, middle schools, high schools. And then 10 p.m. in an area like this where we're primarily residential. If we're in a commercial area, then we'll see a real steady spike, or not a spike, but a steady usage. It runs from 8 or 9 a.m. till about 6 p.m.
So basically, your estimate in the capacity need, would you say it's 80% data from the internet and 20% phone calls? What numbers could you share with us?
It would probably be 10% phone calls and about 90% data.
Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about safety for workers. I had a buddy of mine who's a roofer, and he was telling me, you know, what about the safety for the duration of the exposure if you're right up next to, as close as you could be. So, go ahead.
Yes, I took a look at that. It wasn't in their original RF analysis, but I did look at what if you're at the level of the antenna, how close you could be before you would exceed the public exclusion zone. And for this particular site, that would be 9 feet. So there were no rooftops or other vertical elements that would pose such a situation in this particular case.
So 9 feet for a 24-hour period?
9 feet for, any period.
For any period, that's
right.
the maximum.
That's correct. So any place 9 feet or beyond at the level of the antenna, you'd be below the public exposure standard, which is considered to be safe for continuous exposure, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
My question about the gap in coverage is this is Verizon's own analysis. This is not an independent analysis.
This is true. We try to be highly accurate on that because it does affect our financials. We can't afford to be building cell sites where cell sites don't need to be built.
Right. So getting an independent company to provide that information shouldn't take that much time, or how would that work?
We have done it in some areas. We've brought in third parties to review all of our calculations to make sure that everything is accurate. It has been done in the past. I haven't had one done lately, but it's been validated numerous times.
We just concluded litigation with the city of Fremont, where the Fremont City Council didn't believe that there was a significant gap, and we agreed to a third-party review of the data that had been created by Verizon Wireless to show a coverage and capacity gap, and the RF engineer confirmed that there was a significant gap in data and in capacity and coverage. In every situation I've been in where we've had a third-party review of Verizon's data, it has confirmed a significant gap. Again, I have to reiterate that in the public right-of-way, we have the right to place telephone equipment on the telephone pole without having to show or demonstrate a need. I don't think there's any need for third-party review of our gap analysis. I think it's self-evident here, but I don't know if that's and how that would be carried out. But we did just conclude this in conjunction with the litigation in Fremont. The order was filed today by the court, allowing the site to go forward.
Right, that's in Fremont. You're in San Bruno now.
No. Thank you. I am.
Well,
Oh, no, not you. When you're speaking, sir, would you speak a little closer to the mic when you're at the
I'm
podium?
sorry, yes.
No, not,
Oh.
you don't have to repeat yourself, but I just, so everybody can hear. Thanks.
I guess clearly, people are concerned about this. And when a for-profit company, and I believe it was Dwayne that said it perfectly, that you analyzed all the areas, and this is the best location, most effective, most profitable. However, it's in a residential area. It goes contrary to what most people want. And having an independent analysis provided probably would get you a little bit more credibility. Nonetheless, I'll follow up with that. So it's optimum where you're putting it, and I believe you. It wouldn't be as optimum to put a couple antennas further away, but it would still help. No. Go ahead.
As I mentioned earlier, if we put them further away, we still have that distance issue that makes them incredibly inefficient, and they would exhaust most likely the day we turned them up. We've done that. We've made that mistake before. We've made a lot of mistakes before. That is something that we have tried, and it fails every time it's done. It makes total engineering sense, but there's times that we're forced into that position. And the amount of capacity that's gained by putting a site at a distance from the user base, it doesn't provide enough of a capacity increase to get you through even a year or two without having to put in additional sites that are closer to the user base. Does that make sense?
I got that. It's still an optimum place, that what you're talking about for placing this one. Now that's based on a location on El Camino, or is it further out at that other site, that the SFO site? I don't have I don't remember the actual.
The El Camino
SFO
Real is the area, the commercial area, the closest commercial area is along El Camino Real.
So your analysis is for, or your, let me rephrase my question. So I had heard from Councilman Salazar that, and your answer was, if you put another antenna up where the SFO antenna was, it would be diminished or used up instantaneously.
It would do no good. We have all the antennas we could possibly put up there.
So if you put an antenna on El Camino but went higher than 50 foot, what would that do for your data, your capacity? It wouldn't be optimum.
I'm going to give you just a kind of a theoretical just based off my experience. That would probably double the amount of capacity we have. The problem is we're queuing capacity on SFO West. We're already probably at double the capacity of that site, and the usage grows at 70% a year. So we could put something up on El Camino Real, and by the time we got it built, even if it was at a 100-foot tower, it would be overloaded.
Because there's so many people.
Because of the distance
And the
from
data.
where the users are
Got it.
to where the site is. It suffers from the same problem that SFO West and the site to the north there suffers from.
So you mentioned,
Folks,
mentioned a 70%
please.
increase. Is that the number that currently that it's around 70% increase that we're
Data increase a year.
Data increase.
Correct, yeah.
And your projections for coverage in San Bruno is only 9 towers to be able to keep up with that increase in capacity.
If we put towers closer to the users, they'll carry about 10 times the capacity of a site that's distant.
Got
from
it.
the
I got that part. But for the future, I know we're talking about this one location, but I can't help but be curious that if the data is going to be more and more people are going to want to get on and use your service, you're going to need more and more of these antennas.
That is true, and as 5G and different technologies, we approach everything we can from a technology standpoint. That's the most cost-effective way for us to provide service, is to take advantage.
Folks, excuse me. Ma'am, please. The process that we have discussed is council now has an opportunity to ask the questions. We still have one or two. Ma'am, please. And then we're opening. Okay, folks, if we need to take a break, we'll do that. Okay, so listen. The public hearing was closed on July 24th. We are having folks able to speak. I've asked them to kind of speed it up a little bit. I understand folks want to speak, and we want to have that. We're going to have, ma'am, please. Okay. Let's take a break, please.
That is not going to help. That's not going to help.
Okay, all right. Okay, ma'am.
No, thank you. We have one more council member after me, and I have one more question, and I definitely want to hear from everybody too. So, thank you for your patience. So basically, we're talking about the future and how more and more of these towers, until a new technology is developed that's going to be able to handle that, which potentially could be 5G, because these antennas are not for 5G. Is that correct?
No, they're not.
Okay. And there is some technology available for where people could put their own, I guess, antennas in their home. Verizon recently announced something like that going on in Texas.
That is correct.
Okay, so can you share what that is?
So there are something that's called a Pico cell site that people can purchase. They run $300 to about $1,000. It connects to the wireless or the broadband that a person has in their home, and it creates a small within the home cell site. It will cover inside the home. It won't cover out. It doesn't help anything with emergency services that are going to an area. They go down in the case of any type of a power outage. But it will allow a person, we have lots of them in some of the more affluent neighborhoods where the houses are 12,000 square foot and signals don't get into the house. They'll use a number of those inside of a home. It is an option that will help a person improve the capacity and coverage inside of their home.
Okay, thank you.
Anything for you, Henry? Councilmember O'Connell.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to make a comment about staff and the appellant's comments about their sincerity or their work ethic or whatever disingenuous remarks you made. Staff is given a task, they carry it out professionally, they keep their personal feelings to themselves, and they use the science that they've learned because they're engineers. That's what staff does. They are not touties to any commercial, anybody. Some of them live in San Bruno, and I think it was very, as I said, disingenuous that you commented that way about them. So I just wanted to make that comment. And I had two other things I wanted to hear about, but maybe they're more appropriate at the end, and maybe staff can kind of think about them while we're listening to people. We've heard a lot of different conflicts about what we can and cannot do legally from different, we've heard from our consultant, we've heard from Verizon, we've heard from the appellant. So at the end of all this, I'd like us to be very clear about what we can and cannot do. We've heard a lot about what other cities have done. I want to clarify this one. I thought I heard the appellant say San Francisco banned small cells. But I also heard Verizon say you have 400 small cell, 90 or something. Could you clarify that, please?
The appellants raised several jurisdictions where Verizon Wireless has been working on small cell networks, and I'd be happy to go through every single one of them.
No, I just want to know that one.
In San Francisco, we have nearly 100 utility pole facilities and over 400 small cell facilities on light standards. There are 3 on the block around my office.
Okay.
Thank you. I can go on further if you wish.
Okay, that's all I have for now.
Okay, so we have 12? I'm sorry, we're moving on to the comments from...
We'll be happy to come up and answer questions later.
Comments from council. So we have 12 speaker cards that have been placed with the city clerk. That's who we'll have speaking. I think if we work together, we can go 2 minutes. What the clerk had suggested is calling folks up a few at a time, just to save the time to come up and walk up, so that we can get everybody heard. Again, I would ask that everybody be respectful and allow the speaker to have their time. And so if we can refrain from clapping until the end. And
we have 13, just
13.
for clarification.
We can do it.
The first speaker is John Anderson. The second speaker is Patrick Murphy. The third is Mike Brainey.
All 3 can make their way to the podium, please. And that will help speed up a little time, please. And again, it'll be 2 minutes. Thank you.
I don't think I'm going to need my 2 minutes, but there are some things I just didn't hear in the whole presentation. How much does the new equipment weigh? What studies have they done to see the kind of gusts it can withstand in a storm? Because as everyone here knows, we get some pretty windy storms here. And that makes me worry about fire danger. And I didn't hear anybody really address those.
Okay. Thank you. We'll take all public comment and then go back. Next,
Patrick
please.
Murphy.
Patrick Murphy.
I congratulate everybody who is still here, and I hope, for your sake, gentlemen, ladies,
Sir, I'm sorry.
So they can hear you.
that you don't judge the smallness of the crowd, but because at least half have gone home. My name is Patrick Murphy, a 48-year San Bruno resident. I'm reading this to save time. I'm not going to talk about the health risks. They have already been talked about. And the scientific evidence is mounting. You mentioned independent studies. The Monterey Planning Commission refused a similar Verizon application, the first cell tower in residential, after a city-sponsored analysis of the Verizon plan concluded that to accomplish its goals, Verizon would eventually need thousands of cell installations in residential neighborhoods in Monterey. A couple of other factors were at play. The people who showed up, like people here, were angry, but unlike people here, there are many in Monterey rich and powerful, with easy access to legal action if necessary. But our group is not accustomed, our community is not accustomed to dealing with municipal powers or giant corporations. Verizon knows this. They see this vibrant city as Little San Bruno, a sleepy town of retired citizens, middle-class working people, and largely defenseless immigrants holding down smaller jobs. A much easier target, easier to be taken advantage of. But even though Verizon is poised to take advantage of the folks in Little San Bruno, this has been covered. They do not have to saturate our residential neighborhoods. But there are alternatives. These are easier paths. As the saturation progresses, there are already 9 applications, there will be hundreds. No one's home, yours, mine, will be able to avoid the ground zero situation that threatens the folks in the 100 block of Elm Avenue. Of course, there is the tempting promise of lucrative leasing revenues, enriching the city treasury. First from Horizon, then from many other carriers, multiplying the radiation in neighborhoods many, many times.
Can you please start to wind it up a little, please?
Oh, you bet.
Thank you.
But let's hope I'm done. But let's hope our city council believes San Mateo's motto, the city with a heart, and pays attention to the heart of this middle-class town, sensitive to the will of the constituents, and not let Verizon get its huge foot in the door, which will inevitably lead to our bustling, thriving city becoming a cell town jungle and a radiation nightmare. Thank you.
So again, if you could, next speakers, could you please call them out?
Mike Bronny, Stacy Tolentino, followed by Michael Mazzola.
And again, it is 2 minutes. There are lights on the podium. When you see yellow, it means, Melissa, how much time?
When you see yellow, you have a 30-second wrap-up.
State your name.
And then the red means stop.
If you could just face the mic, just so that it gets picked up properly. Thank you.
First speaker, Stacy Tolentino.
Good evening, Mayor Medina and City Council members. When we, the citizens of San Bruno, voted all of you into office, we were hopeful that you would represent us and act with our best interest in mind at all times, and want to make it clear that saying no to cell towers in San Bruno is in our community's best interest. We, the citizens of San Bruno, do not want to be guinea pigs. We don't want to sit tight and wait to see what terrible health consequences and adverse effects electromagnetic fields and low-dose radiation will cause us after a decade or two of having cell towers in our neighborhoods. Those of us who own homes are worried that our property values will decline if we have cell towers in our neighborhoods. I also want to remind all of you that 8 years ago, San Bruno experienced the horrible and deadly tragedy of the PG&E pipeline explosion, and that we cannot risk another potential tragedy in our community, one that could be caused by a devastating fire like the 2007 Malibu fire, which was caused by overloaded telecommunications on utility poles. Are all of you aware that last week the SF Gate reported that members of the Mill Valley City Council voted unanimously to block deployments of 5G towers in the city's residential areas by activating an urgency ordinance? The legislation, which is active immediately, allows authorities to enact regulations affecting the health and safety of residents. The truth is, there really is no need for 5G technology in San Bruno. WirelessOracle.com provides totally unbiased information about wireless coverage in the cities across the nation, and their report shows that currently Verizon has the best coverage in San Bruno, California, and that overall our city has above average wireless coverage compared to the nation. Okay? My family does not want a cell phone tower outside the front window of our house or on our block, and I'm certain that none of you do either. So tonight, I urge all of you, our elected officials, to have a heart. Please do not allow Verizon to install cell towers on Elm Street or on any of our residential neighborhoods in San Bruno. Thank you.
Thank you. And so, folks, if we keep in mind 2 minutes, because I want to make sure everybody gets heard and has equal time. Sir.
Michael Mazzola, followed by Zidane Millie.
I would like to start with the idea of cigarettes. This was something that everyone thought was fine, but we now know not to do. However, this conclusion took decades to fully get to, and for everyone to fully accept this. This technology is just too new. There has not been enough time to investigate it, and we do not know the true consequences of it. Your decision tonight reminded me of a quote that I'd read long ago. It is not often that a man has the opportunity to directly influence the lives of those around him, and it is in these moments that we see the true depth of that man's character. When a man has an opportunity to change the future of those around him, he must not look in upon himself, but out into the world of others. And in that moment, he must make the decision that is not best for himself, but best for all. In that defining moment, he must choose that which is truly wanted of him. Your decision tonight does not just affect you, but everyone after you. As you go to bed tonight, this decision will weigh on you, for you have decided our future. Whether or not it is fully dawned on society, the reality is that our generation will soon have to assume the responsibility for a world crafted by previous generations. My generation inherits the world that you make for me. Your decision tonight affects my life and the lives of those after me, thousands, perhaps millions of people. You must make a decision for all of us to prohibit these towers from being put in our neighborhood. If San Bruno is truly the city with a heart, then I ask you to use yours to prohibit these towers from entering our town.
Thank you very much for your comments. Next, please.
Zidane Millie, followed by Allison Mazzola.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and City Council members. My name is Zidane Millie. I'm 17. I go to Cappuccino High School, and I'm a senior, and I've lived in San Bruno my whole life. And this is... I first want to say I feel grateful for growing up in San Bruno. I'm proud of the San Bruno community for coming together like tonight, for what we believe in that truly shows our love for the city and each other. We're here to discuss the Verizon cell towers that would be placed in front of people's homes. We are not going to wait anymore to address this situation. And we're not going to wait anymore for a fire disaster to happen, which happened a couple years ago with PG&E. Some people are concerned with the cell towers falling and causing fires. So, we're also not going to wait anymore for you as City Council members to resolve this situation. I would like to point out that you're placing these cell towers on Elm, but that's only 2 blocks away from El Camino. That's not even half a mile, nor even a quarter of a mile. There's plenty of utility poles near Sylvia's restaurant, and there's no obstruction or trees. We need to be the city that turns away Verizon from following through with these cell towers. Many other local cities have turned away Verizon from placing cell towers in front of our houses, so why can't we? This is not a prediction, this is a spoiler. We will fight until the end, and it will result in not having these cell towers in front of our homes. Mr. Mayor, we chose you to be the mayor because we believe you will protect us and do what's best for San Bruno, not Verizon. We are the city that will fight until the end and the city that will show our strength. We are San Bruno. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for your comments. Next speakers, please.
Allison Mazzola, followed by Julia Larson. Seeing neither, Mia Diaz-Edelman, followed by Jesse Diaz.
My name is Dr. Mia Diaz-Edelman, and I've lived in San Bruno most of my life. I love this city, and I'm so proud to be part of it. And I think it's really important to note that and I also recognize many beautiful faces here, because this is a place that people just want to stay. It's so important. It's so dear to our hearts. And I want to take note that the FCC is the same organization that is saying what the public exposure limits are, as well as prioritizing and privileging aesthetics over our health and well-being. And so I'm going to speak in their language. I find it aesthetically nauseating that we know that non-thermals, much of the research has been done on thermal radiation effects, and there's very little that has been done on non-thermal, chronic, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 10-year plus exposure. And so when we're putting these cell towers on residential homes, we are not looking at the effects. And I find it aesthetically repulsive that there is childhood leukemia as a result of this non-thermal consequence of exposure, long-term exposure, brain tumors, genotoxic effects, neurological effects, and neurodegenerative diseases and immune system deregulation, as well as chronic headaches and difficulty sleeping. Our children, who we've just heard from their voices directly, are calling us to be responsible. They're challenging who we say we are, the city with a heart. And they are asking us to choose companies that value a social responsibility, that understand their social responsibility. We've heard from Congresswoman Eshoo, who has written letters to the FCC criticizing the fact that there aren't any worker protections included in this current legislation. So I ask you to be radically tender-hearted, to be who you say you are, and to not contribute to irreparable and intergenerational costs, especially because it does not discriminate. All of us are impacted by the effects of these cell towers, and the tendency is only to grow bigger and faster, and it's frankly excessive. We don't need that. So, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Next, please.
Jesse Diaz, followed by Julia Larson.
Good evening. I worked in the industry for 33 years, building the whole network, so I'm very familiar with what you're talking about. You're not going to hoodwink us here in San Bruno. I personally had the misfortune to be affected by this technology while I was working for this telecommunication company, AT&T. I'm retired, so it doesn't matter who I say. I had to have surgery because there was an unknown mass growing in my head, and I attribute it to what we're talking about here tonight. I heard also that when I was getting operated on, and I got lucky, they took it all out, it was benign, but I found out another co-worker elsewhere allegedly had the same symptoms I had, and he died in 1 week after the operation. So these are real concerns. These are real issues. I have 6 grandchildren. I love San Bruno. I love my neighbors. I'm very concerned about all the misinformation I heard tonight, okay? I still have a landline because I know in an earthquake, that's the only thing that's going to work. AT&T has their own battery backup in their own buildings. Here I heard tonight that they have battery backups and they took it down because of aesthetics. So what's going to back you up in an earthquake? They're saying that Verizon is going to be the only thing working. I don't believe that. I would suggest you all go back and get your landlines. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, please.
Julia Larson, followed by Carrie Hansel.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, council members, and everybody in attendance here tonight. I'm Julia Larson, I live at 123 Elm Avenue. San Bruno's first neighborhood cell tower will be placed directly in front of my home. 25 feet approximately from my bedroom window, with active equipment, large active equipment directed at my living room. 50-foot cell towers do not belong in a neighborhood. 50-foot cell towers do not belong adjacent to homes where people live 24 hours a day. I've been a homeowner in San Bruno for 36 years. I've raised my family here. I've been involved in the community, in outreach projects. I've taught at St. Andrew's Preschool. I love this city. This city has it all. I want to believe that this includes a city council whose members have residents' best interests at heart. A city council that stands up for its constituents, our safety, well-being, and the value and investment of our homes. Mr. Mayor, I recall years ago when you were working at the rec center and my girls were participating in all of the sports and swimming, all the opportunities San Bruno had to offer. You were all about the kids, all about the families and the San Bruno community. I want to believe that as our mayor, that hasn't changed. I want to trust and believe in our city government. Verizon's engineering problems aren't our problems. We count on you to care about us. Thank you.
Thank you, and you've just aged me and dated me here publicly. But thank you for saying those comments. Please.
Carrie Hansel, followed by Ernie Aquilio.
Good evening. Hello, Mayor Medina and San Bruno City Council and everybody else. I did not come with any prepared statement or anything to read, but I want you to know I also live on the 100 block of Elm Avenue, and I'm here to say I don't want to be Verizon's guinea pig. I want to live in a neighborhood that's safe. I want to feel like I can go to my home and be comfortable. And I agree with everything that all of the other citizens here tonight have said, so I don't have much to add to that, except that our city is always, we have toxins being poured into our environment daily by San Francisco Airport, and we don't need to add to that. That's enough. We don't need any more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Next, please.
Ernie Aquilio, followed by Vito Della Grazie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Council. I'm not even going to attempt to try and make a legal or a scientific argument here, or even an emotional one. I just have a comment that to me is kind of obvious. When you look at the drawing there of the pole, I'm just curious, the gentleman from Verizon said something that they were going to run some software and test the pole, and also they're going to check it for termite damage. And my question is, was any type of real-time testing going to be done in a real-time environment where you take a standard PG&E 38-foot pole and you add 11 feet to it? That's like adding a sail to a sailboat, especially in San Bruno. So I'm wondering if there's going to be any type of real-time testing in that type of environment that's subject to 30 to 35 mile per hour winds 9 months a year. So what he said definitely did not satisfy my concern around safety. I would think that we would want to see some type of real-time testing around that for a significant span of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, please.
Good evening, Mayor Medina and City Council. And if permissible, I'd just like to get an idea of how many people in the room here, by a show of hands, have Verizon Wireless as their carrier. And of those people, how many of you have dropped calls while you were here in San Bruno? 2. Okay, so the point here is this. What this is boiling down to is marketing. Verizon Wireless went from 3G to 4G, which increased the speed limit by 10 times. And they want to be the first ones to get into the market with the 5G LTE network. It's good money. You get in there, you capture a good portion of the market because you're the first. Now, that's fine. But if you stop and think, PG&E, and I used to be an engineer with them, PG&E has easements going across Skyline that can be utilized to put towers. The Caltrans and BART have easements going up just past El Camino that can be used also for putting towers. Topography, you got San Bruno Mountain with all those radio towers up there that also have the cell towers on there. So you've got a pretty good spread around there that if you utilize that, you can cover pretty much the topography. I understand about the data, but to be honest, if we stop and think about the alternatives that are available to them, they have the technology, they have the resources to check it out, and they could figure out a way to use those easements instead of our city streets. Because obviously everybody here feels that it's not going to be safe. It's not about aesthetics, it's about safety, and it's about our community. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, sir. The clerk, is that all? Okay. First of all, thank you, everybody. Applause to all of you here for hanging in, saying your piece, and giving the respect, and thank you very much. So with that, I know there were some questions that have come up. I know Councilmember O'Connell had also asked a question before we opened up to the public, what legally can or cannot we do. But does staff have any follow-up or comments or to some of the questions? I know there was the studies of the weight as the city is receiving monetary into its treasury. There's the aesthetics, the software test poll. Basically, I'm going to call it real-time testing with the true elements of what would be added to it to see if it would then be as safe as it would be as it is today. So I don't know if staff wants.
Sure. I'll take the first stab. Javon Grogan, City Manager. So to the council, there were a number of questions there. I think one of the first ones that was mentioned by the public that you repeated was, is the city getting any resources? The city of San Bruno will not be paid a lease fee for this cell tower. This cell tower is being put on a PG&E pole. To the question of what can the city council regulate? And so Michael went through that through our staff presentation, and it's a few items. The first item is aesthetics. The second item is structural capacity. The third item is height. The fourth item is maintenance. The public notice period, gap coverage, and the RF study. And I'm actually I started on pages 59 of the packet through 61 of the packet. So as far as aesthetics, again, staff's initial recommendation was that the applicant did meet our aesthetic guidelines. That was confirmed by the Planning Commission's decision. As far as structural capacity, the applicant has produced a preliminary structural analysis that through our normal process, if the application is approved and goes forward, the applicant will undertake a deeper structural analysis and submit that when they submit that building permit. If for any reason staff finds that that structural analysis is not sufficient, they will not receive a building permit. And the applicant mentioned as well that through other regulations, PG&E has to do a structural analysis as well. In regards to height, the maximum height for this location is 50 feet. With the extension on the existing pole, that brings the height to 49 feet 10 inches. The next criteria of maintenance, staff feels that the applicant's plan to maintain the site is sufficient, and that is recapped. As far as public notice, we mentioned that as well early on, that the notice requirement is 300 feet. At the first public hearing, it was mentioned that staff surveyed notice 600 feet. That is not the requirement. The requirement is only 300 feet. But for this meeting, because that was said at the first public hearing, we did a 600-foot notice for this meeting. Gap coverage, the city's municipal code, section 12.202050A1, states that the applicant needs to prove that no other residential location is available that would meet a gap in service or other legitimate business need. And so our code, it's very important that council realizes, states that the applicant must demonstrate that there is a non-residential location, that there is not a residential location that could be used, but also they have the option of demonstrating a legitimate business need for placing the site where they do.
Okay, sir, please. The city manager is speaking, so please.
No, I'm sorry, I said non-residential.
Yeah, okay. Sir.
No, right, I'm sorry. No other non-residential site. And next, the last criteria is an RF study. And as was said earlier, the applicant has submitted an RF study that is compliant with FCC guidelines. The other question that was raised by council is what have other cities done? It was mentioned by a number of individuals from the public and from council that some other cities have taken actions to deny these appeals. We can have our outside counsel speak to that issue.
Good evening. I think there's before I talk about other communities, I wanted to just also remind council that in each case, every city that looks at these applications, and these are happening in lots of communities all over the country, their fundamental job of whoever is reviewing the application is to look at the application in the context of what their own code provides. And so what other cities might be doing or might be deciding is really sort of in their own space of what their codes say. And in many cases, in some of the examples that have been given about denials, the denials have actually led to litigation. So whether the city acted properly under their code or under state and federal law is still up in the air because the litigation is not fully resolved. So I don't know if there are particular, I jotted down a few. I know one that was mentioned was that Mill Valley adopted an ordinance recently. That ordinance, I have looked at it for other clients, and it does have some language in it that, first of all, it's not dealing with any specific application, so it's just an ordinance that has been adopted. And so they haven't denied anything under the ordinance yet. I don't think they've processed an application under the ordinance yet. But it also has language in the code that allows for exceptions if there would be a violation of state or federal law. It's a rather lengthy provision, but I'm kind of summarizing what it's talking about. So it's not an absolute prohibition in that ordinance. if there are other cities or that were mentioned or others examples, if I know about them, I can certainly address them.
But City of Monterey was another.
City of Monterey is another. I know a little bit about it. Well, our firm is doing some work for that city, but I haven't been directly involved. And I know that they are, at this moment, I think, reviewing and updating their ordinance. They had some applications in, and I'm not sure if they were from Verizon or if Verizon knows who the applicant was, but I know that they are going through an updating process of their ordinance.
There was a question that was asked about an urgency ordinance. Somebody did ask about that.
That was Mill Valley, I think, that was mentioned as the urgency ordinance.
City of Burlingame and City of San Mateo were two other cities that I know were mentioned in comments, and I think was also mentioned in the report.
The city of, or the town of Hillsborough may have been, I think, was that in the report?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. The town of Hillsborough, our firm again was advising the town on part of that process, and that they did deny a distributed antenna system. So that's a system, in that case it was, I think, 16 or 17 sites that were all connected by fiber and kind of operate as one system. That was denied, and they have been sued by the applicant, that's Crown Castle, and that is at the very beginning stages of that litigation.
And the City of San Mateo recently I thought that was another city mentioned tonight, no?
I have not been involved in City of San Mateo. I'm not certain of what's happened there exactly.
Okay, I think there was also a question in regards to the testing of the realistic standards. No, that's not illegal, but the question came up of you test it today, but when then you add something to it, obviously it gives a different element.
So I think probably Verizon could answer the process better. I do have a background in pole attachment issues. It's pretty sexy work, really. And the pole attachment, what I know of the process for reviewing new attachments to utility poles, is that there is a calculation process that is done that looks at things like the impact of the weight, but also wind loading, and that is done using software, but then when they actually do the installation, they do an inspection of the pole. Like, for example, if they decided that they wouldn't, by just doing the study, they don't think they need to replace the pole, but then they go out and actually look at the pole. If they determine by observation or testing of the pole itself, they will they could determine that they would have to replace the pole. And so it's part of the calculation of deciding what is a safe structure, just like any sort of building code that decides what is a safe structure for your roof, given the weight of the roof and that there might be wind and things like that. The same kind of concepts are applied to utility poles.
Okay. I think it answered most of the questions that I jotted down from the public, unless there's something I've missed. So then we're back to anything else from staff at this time in regards to anything else? So then we're back to
well, the very
council.
the very first question to answer your question was how much does the equipment weigh? And I would assume that through the process of submitting the application and the permit, a lot more of that detail will come out of that application. So I know we don't have those details tonight, but it goes back to the assessment of the pole, the testing of the intrusion, et cetera.
So it's back to council then at this point. Please, Michael.
So I am going to address this question to our outside counsel regarding what is granted if this application moves forward. I understand that then the the carrier is allowed to make other modifications without review. Is that accurate? Say they wanted to upgrade their equipment, then they would no longer have to go through this process. They now have their claim staked, and it's theirs to do with as they please.
So this application is for what you'd call like a zoning approval, and then they would go through the other permits that would be required that we've been talking about, the encroachment or building permit, and there may be electrical and other inspections, things like that. Once the facility is constructed, I think you may be thinking of, there is a federal law and FCC order implementing that law that we call Section 6409, or an eligible facilities request kind of law. And what that was a law adopted in Congress in 2012, and it said that if a change to an existing facility meets certain standards, it falls within a certain box, and I don't mean size, but it meets certain criteria, then that application for that modification to that facility must be approved by a local government. And the FCC issued a lengthy order and rules that determined what precisely would be the criteria that would have to be met to qualify for that automatic approval. It doesn't say that you wouldn't have to go through a process. It says that you would have to, as an applicant, come and demonstrate that you qualify for that approval. And one of the criteria, for example, is that you can't defeat the existing concealment elements of the facility. So if the facility has concealment and the modification would defeat that concealment, that would kick them out of the box, and they would have to go through the regular approval process. Another element that can kick you out of the box is if there is excavation beyond the site. And so that would be if there was, had to be more digging or something that was beyond the immediate site. There are different other criteria that have to, some are size and height and things like that. And so that would be the kind of thing that potentially could come up in the future, that there may be a modification to this site, and they would have to determine whether they thought they qualified, and then the city would have to review that to determine whether they qualified or whether they had to go through a regular process.
Okay. So from what I understand about these new antennas, and they are, from what I know, fairly new to the industry, they can operate at a fairly broad spectrum of frequencies, from very, very low to very high. The information that was provided in the report, I think, alluded to the fact that they did their safety testing at 2 of those frequencies, and say they decided that now they wanted to operate at a different frequency because it was more advantageous to their technology. Would that then trigger, in your experience, could that trigger a re-review of the process where we could again evaluate how safe and how sound their analysis is, or would they be able to just change frequencies and not let us know?
Well, I think every carrier has certain frequencies that they use that they are licensed to use, and they get those licenses usually through auctions, and so they spend a lot of money to get those, and those are sort of the parameters that they have to operate within. So if they were to, in the future, acquire some other spectrum that is other frequencies, and then apply for a modification that would just be a change out of an antenna, they would still have to meet another one of those things to keep them in the box of a 6409 application, is that they have to meet the existing conditions. So the existing conditions of the existing site would still apply, and so the condition is that they have to, it complies with FCC standards for radiation. Whatever they put on that facility would also have to comply. So they'd have to demonstrate that they would still be meeting those conditions.
And you cited specifically if they have to apply for a license, but say 5G, that operates, from what I understand, mostly in the unlicensed frequency range. So no license, no review?
Well, there are, no license, no review, but that they have to comply, all of the equipment that they put on or any changes they make to the equipment, the condition, one of the conditions of approval is that it complies with FCC standards, and that would continue to apply no matter what they tried to change on that facility.
And could the council or the city impose specific language identifying those situations and basically get agreement from the carrier that those things would, that there's an agreement up front that those things would require reapproval? Or is that outside of our ability?
I think it might be difficult to anticipate all of the things that might change, but the general principle is they would have to come and demonstrate that they are complying with the conditions. And so if the conditions require them to, operate consistent with FCC standards, that would apply no matter what they might propose to do in the future.
Okay. Yeah, and I think, I personally, and then I think probably a lot of people in San Bruno put very little faith in the federal government to protect our, our safety. And the state hasn't been much better. PUC hasn't proven to be much of a champion. So, where we can, if this does move forward, I'd like to see us come up with as much protection as we can.
That's all. Okay. Anything else from council? Marty, any final questions? Laura?
Yeah,
Please.
I do. I'm same, sort of this going down the same path as you, Michael, but, my concern is, number one, we talked about other cities. I know that Petaluma recently also had a denial of, adopted an ordinance with a residential buffer zone. So what stance do we have here tonight to discuss changes to the ordinance, number one, right? And that would be for sites going forward, is my understanding. That we couldn't change this application for 123 Elm. It could be for future sites, but maybe you can answer that question. Maybe let's answer that question first.
Sure. So council has to decide this matter based on our existing code, and it's not agendized tonight to talk about changes to that code, but what council can do is direct staff to embark on a process to look at changes to the code, because I think it's been said tonight, and it's true, that this is not the only small cell application that we will receive, and so council can provide that direction. We just are not at liberty to have that discussion tonight because it's not agendized.
And then my next question would be, without asking Verizon this, because of course, we're going to get an answer that benefits the applicant, and that is, are there easier paths that Verizon can choose? A number of council have asked the kind of question in a roundabout way, and we've gotten some answers, but is there something that we can do as a city to investigate what are the other options out there? For example, we talked about El Camino is 0.2 miles away, right? There are other locations. I think a question that was asked at the July meeting, what about a cell tower at San Bruno Park, which is at a higher elevation? So I don't know that we've gotten a full answer, or I feel confident enough in saying, yeah, you know what, 123 Elm is a choice. That's the best choice out there. I don't feel that. I can't base that based on what I'm hearing from them, but I don't feel confidently that we've done, or we have the facts to make that decision. Anybody else here or understand that question, or? Well, I guess it's a question for staff: is can we go back and we get our? I mean, at this point in the game, do we have a choice to choose this, or do we have a choice, or can we make a decision that I can't vote this because I'm not confident to say that there aren't other options for us out there? Why would I want to provide a cell tower in a residential neighborhood 25 feet away from somebody's bedroom?
And I think, to summarize, council, it's, there's to either uphold the appeal, deny the appeal. There also is a correct me, staff or legal counsel, it can be delayed for further information based on, we're talking about the coverage, we're talking about the city park. I understand going forward, yes, I would like to have staff work with the planning commission to sit down and talk about the zoning and how this goes future. We're here tonight for this, but we also know this is something we're going to continue to revisit. And I think if we need to modify that other cities are doing, like South San Francisco, or what they're looking to for buffer zone from residential locations and or for the zoning and code, then that needs to be modified, updated, and it needs to be done quickly because they're in the pipeline. But going back to this, my understanding is there are 3 options for the council to decide at this time. Am I correct?
Yes, and so those 3 options are accept the appeal, which means that the cell tower would not be approved, reject the appeal, which means that the cell tower would be approved, or postpone for a reason such as additional information. And so, Councilmember Davis, one of your questions was there may potentially be other sites, and I think what you articulated is you don't feel satisfied that the applicant has demonstrated that they have really looked at all non-residential sites, which is something that's required in our code. And the other thing that you said is that maybe there are other poles that the applicant can locate on. To the latter one, unfortunately, federal law does not give us that ability to say, we don't want you to locate on this pole, we think you should locate on this pole. So the law gives them the right to use utility poles in the public right-of-way. But to the former one, if the council feels that they are not satisfied that the applicant has demonstrated that there are not that there are no other non-residential locations and would like to request additional information, that is conceivably something that the council can do. One of the things the applicant talked about tonight is potentially having a third-party analysis and verification of that. That is an option that is available to the council. One of the things that staff will recommend is one of the challenges with this application is that the applicant has agreed to stay the 150-day shot clock. And so we would like to have agreement with the applicant that they will continue to stay that shot clock because one of the risks of not doing that is because 150 days has elapsed, the applicant has the ability to make a statement that they feel that this application has been deemed approved, and then legal counsel can opine on the next steps if that happens, but we would have to go into court to have that revoked.
Go ahead.
Before I do that, I just wanted to make also just a comment and not just an observation about the discussion this evening, because it did go on for quite a long time, and there were a number of alternatives suggested, both by the appellants and by council members, and Verizon did address those and explain. I'm not saying what you should think about their explanation, but they did attempt to provide evidence, or they did provide evidence, their explanation about why those other sites might not be feasible in their network design. I just wanted to remind people about that. With respect to a delay for further consideration of additional information or alternatives, one thing to bear in mind is that there is as you mentioned, because of the federal rules that have developed these shot clocks and the agreement that we have now, the city has now with a kind of informal agreement right now with Verizon to toll the application of those shot clocks through this council meeting. If we were to delay further, there is a possibility, not under federal law, but actually under state law. There is a state law that was adopted 2.5, 3 years ago. The bill was SB 57, and that one provides that if you miss a federal shot clock for action, then it gives the right to the applicant to send a letter saying that you've missed the shot clock, and that their application should be deemed approved because you didn't act in time. On receipt of that letter, the only way to stop the deemed approval would be for the city to go to court within 30 days of receiving that letter to initiate a legal proceeding to get a court to rule that the deemed granted under that state law should not apply to this application. So it's your opportunity to defend why you needed more time, why that you shouldn't be deemed granted, or otherwise the statute should not apply to that application. So that is a remedy that's been provided under state law that sort of turns the tables in terms of who could initiate litigation and or how easily it can be initiated.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Michael?
A few comments.
Please.
So, regarding what Councilman Medina brought up regarding, another evaluation of the need for the capacity, I would tend to lend credence to the applicant on that because I agree you probably wouldn't be trying to get there if you didn't think there was a need for you to spend money to build it. I also know from what I understand of the industry that this type of technology it's coming, and it's coming big time. Some cities are falling over themselves to put this into their neighborhoods. Clearly, our neighborhoods are not. So I question the business sense in going to neighborhoods where clearly the people are saying, not here, versus some other cities where people are feeling a real need. They're feeling that the digital divide that they talk about so much, where there is no other service available, and there is really a certifiable need. Clearly, you feel it's a business need because it helps grow your business. The public may have a different opinion, and they do have other options. Unfortunately, the other point I wanted to make too is, in terms of picking a location, is this the best location? No matter where we put another antenna, it's going to affect somebody's neighborhood. There's very few spots in San Bruno where people don't live, and so putting this antenna here or in front of somebody else's property probably is going to have the same impact on somebody's neighborhood. And in fact, putting up the macro sites that have to operate at higher power probably have more detriment to the neighborhoods where we put those. And even though we have easements throughout the city, people live next to those easements as well. So we're going to affect somebody. So I don't know that there's an optimum situation. And so the conversation gets narrowed farther and farther into what we're able to actually determine. A while back we heard, we had an appeal to someone who wanted to put a giant whale head at the mouth of a car wash. And we were told, that we had limited things that we could use to judge that. Again, we were pointed to the municipal code. And in this case, we were told, focus on what aesthetics are defined, or how our aesthetics are defined in the municipal code. So I looked through the municipal code, I searched through it everywhere where aesthetics shows up, and there really isn't much guidance there. It's still very subjective. So I voted for the whalehead, nobody else did. Whalehead didn't happen. So maybe I have a very low bar, but in this case, I don't agree that merely camouflaging a big metal box to be old wood color is enough to make it blend into the neighborhood. A while ago, I applied for a permit to apply stucco to my house, and I was told there's no other stucco houses on your block, so you can't have stucco. So it's very subjective, I think. And so telling us that we have aesthetics as our the thing to go to, it's not a very strong position for us to take. So I definitely agree with the Vice Mayor that we need to revisit that going forward. We don't have the tools we need to make the decisions and to protect the neighborhoods in a way that's fair. But I mentioned before that this is a fairly new technology. I know you guys are in a hurry to get into the neighborhoods with it. Maybe when it gets refined, can you guys come back with a better, more appealing, something that doesn't look like big metal boxes that are painted to match the background? Then it'll eliminate pretty much the one thing that we have to object to. And again, I question the business sense in trying to force yourselves into a neighborhood where there is opposition. There are easier targets, and so I mean, I'm prepared to uphold the appeal just based on the fact that it does not look good. And I've seen similar setups, and they're all over San Francisco. I know they're in other cities, and in a hurry to get into neighborhoods, these things are just being thrown on poles, and they don't look good. And I do think that San Bruno deserves to have nicer equipment put on the streets. We do take pride in our homes and our streets, and I don't think that this contributes to the aesthetics of what we're striving for.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Salazar. Irene, did you have anything? I know we haven't. Did you have anything at this time?
No.
Okay. Marty?
And thank you, Councilman Salazar, for that. So I'm looking at page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of our staff report. And so, help me out, Council, if I'm out of step here. So, of these 6 criteria, aesthetics, structural capability, height, maintenance, gap coverage, radio frequency, those are the 6 things that we consider at this point. Yes. Radio frequency, health hazard, I don't trust the government that much either, but we cannot use that in our decision tonight. Correct?
If the applicant demonstrates that they are meeting the FCC standards, you are preempted from considering it. Yep.
So they've shown that they've met that. The maintenance, I believe they could make that. The height, they're 2 inches below our 50-foot limit. The structural capability, they'll find a way to structurally engineer this. It's not going to be a problem for them. So we got 2 different things, the way I look at it. Gap coverage, which I'm not confident that it's not independent. This is their data, right? Not an independent data. So I would like to see more independence in that data. But what it comes down really for me is it's the aesthetics. It looks horrible. Our neighborhoods are established right under 40 foot. We're going to throw something up another 30% higher. It doesn't look good. It's not a neighborhood setting. So I'm prepared to vote to uphold the appeal and deny this application.
Okay. So,
Can I talk?
can I talk? So,
Oh, can you hear? Can you hear? Is it on?
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You can hear me?
People can
Okay.
hear me without the mic. So, for myself, it comes down to some basics. The gap coverage, I concur with Councilmember Medina. When we have anybody who brings something forward, you need independence, right? And that's why even when we go out to bids for projects, why do you get 3? Because if you just got 1, you're not going to have much information to obtain and cross-reference to see the best possible deal you may get. The other thing is on the aesthetics. I understand it's at the top of the poll. I understand what we want to say, what it could be, what it should be, but the problem is, you look at the picture, it just doesn't look good. That's the bottom line. I think the question comes up, and again, we are here about 123 Elm, but it's also specifically to that, and now we have this, and it is presented to us, and I know there were other options, but in essence, the other options do the same thing. They do the same thing of having that still the aesthetic issue that I see here, and that would be evident. So I'm sharing in my colleagues to my left's comments on that.
I appreciate the overwhelming amount of phone calls, emails, calls from city concerned residents. I too live in the city, and I understand concerns from all sides, either for or against cell towers in our neighborhoods. A resident recently wrote, "Please approve the new cell phone towers technology. We need the technology as required infrastructure for the future." So let's think about that for a minute. How many times in our own homes are we using this type of service? Refrigerators nowadays, washing machines, of course we all use it for televisions, gaming consoles. Probably one of the most important things we have in our homes today is our security systems, doorbells, baby monitors, and the big one, of course, cell phones. The list is endless. We all want dependability when it comes to technology. We get frustrated when a call drops or you can't make an outgoing call. I know this firsthand after the tragic event in our city, when I stood at the top of Glenview after the explosion in our city, trying to get cell reception, and within minutes, we couldn't. I made one phone call to a council member and said we got a problem, and that was it. Technology is more about every day. We are in it, we are living it, we are breathing it. I guarantee you that every resident in this home also wants that technology. But I can't sit here today and say that the technology needs to be 25 feet from my bedroom. And I know I can't make a decision based on that. But what I can make a decision on, basically, is I don't want more ugliness in our city. I don't want the ugliness behind my home on a pole that is already full of wires. 50 feet in the air, high winds, durability, dependability. I've seen poles go down. We've seen fires. We've seen fires in our own community. We've seen fires in other communities. But from an aesthetic standpoint, I too can't choose to vote for this.
Okay, so we need to take some council action, and the Vice Mayor is correct. We have had a lot of emails. We have read them, so don't think they aren't. I've had a couple phone calls I returned. One is this afternoon, which I enjoyed the conversation. There you are. And I rattled too much, but I said, you know, you helped me get me in my get centered today, so thank you for coming. You did commit, so it's nice to meet you. So this is an emotional issue that has brought us here. But again, the process is, again, the right to have an appeal 10 days after the Planning Commission, which was done, and that's why somebody had asked me, how did we get here? So Planning Commission sees it, votes on it, an appeal was done within a certain time frame, and so that's why we're here. So with that, council, action?
Mr. Mayor,
oh, I'm sorry, let me go to the city attorney.
Before the council does act, I just wanted to make sure everybody understands that if there is a motion to uphold the appeal, as appears to be the case, then staff will need to come back to a subsequent city council meeting with a resolution making, yes it is,
Could you talk more into it?
The staff will need to come back to a subsequent meeting with a resolution for your approval on the consent calendar for the findings for upholding the appeal, as opposed to what staff recommended, which is to deny the appeal.
Understood. It means a resolution would have to come back in order to take action on what's determined one way or the other tonight, if it's against the denial. So anyway, action from council? We do need a motion. We don't need that. We need a motion and a second, and it will be roll call.
Okay. I will make a motion that we uphold the appeal.
Wait. Some of you heard him. Go ahead. They couldn't really hear you all.
Can you hear? Okay, for the record then, I would like to make a motion to uphold the appeal in front of us tonight.
Motion made, and there's been a second.
And I'll second.
Mr. Medina seconded. Roll call, please, City Clerk.
Councilmember Medina.
Aye.
Councilmember O'Connell.
Bless you.
Councilmember Salazar.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Davis.
Aye.
Mayor Medina.
Aye. We are going to take a break, and we do appreciate your patience and you staying with us through the evening. We do care. This community cares. But again, I do appreciate you staying here into this evening. We're going to take a break. All right, we're reconvening back to San Bruno City Council meeting.